Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to many people. When I do, they usually think I'm making it up or that I saw a bear. Trust me, I know what a bear looks like. What I saw that day in October of 1983 wasn't any bear, and it wasn't a person either. My hunting buddy Jim and I had been planning our trip to the Powderhorn primitive area in Colorado for months. We'd been hunting together for years, and this was supposed to be just another trip. We were both experienced outdoorsmen. I'd been hunting since I was 12, and Jim had been a guide for a few seasons in his 20s. We knew the wilderness, we knew animals, and we knew how to tell the difference between a deer, an elk, and a bear. That morning started like any other hunting trip. We were up before dawn, the air so cold, our breath hung like clouds in front of our faces. The plan was to hike up to higher ground and set up camp there before we started hunting properly. It's better hunting up high, and we wanted to be in position before first light the next day. The hike was tough. We had all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, water, rifles, ammo, everything on our backs. By mid-morning, we'd made good progress up the mountain. The October sun was bright but not warm, and the aspens had already turned gold. It was one of those perfect Colorado fall days. Clear blue sky, not a cloud to be seen. We stopped for a water break around 11. We were on a ridge that gave us a good view of the valley below. Jim had his rifle slung over his shoulder, and I had mine propped against a rock while I dug through my pack for some beef jerky. That's when Jim grabbed my arm. "Hard! Look," he said, pointing down toward a grassy slope maybe 300 yards away. "What the hell is that?" At first, I thought it was a bear. It was big, dark-colored, moving on all fours across the open area, but then it stood up and kept standing up. My mouth went dry instantly. What I was seeing didn't make sense. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, and they sure as hell don't walk like that. "Get your binocs," Jim whispered, already raising his to his eyes. My hands were shaking as I pulled my binoculars from my pack. When I finally got them focused, I nearly dropped them. The creature was walking upright, but not like a human. It had this strange, fluid gait, powerful but somehow graceful. Its arms were incredibly long, swinging slightly as it moved. I'd guess it weighed at least 350 pounds, all muscle from what I could tell. "Are you seeing this?" Jim's voice was barely audible. "Yeah," was all I could manage. Jim had the better binoculars, expensive German ones he'd spent a small fortune on. He was getting a better look than me. "I can see its face," he whispered. "There's white hair around its eyes and mouth. The rest of it is darker, and its eyes, Jesus Christ, its eyes are like yellow-orange, like nothing I've ever seen before." I adjusted my focus, trying to see what he was seeing, but I couldn't make out those details. What I could see was enough, though. This wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. Neither of us spoke for what felt like forever. We just watched this thing crossing that slope like it owned the place. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. It didn't look around nervously like a deer or an elk would. It didn't sniff the air constantly like a bear. It just walked, straight and deliberate, across that open, grassy area toward the edge of a bluff that overlooked Cabola Creek. My camera. I suddenly remembered I had a camera in my pack, but I couldn't move. I literally could not make my hands reach for my backpack. It was like I was frozen in place, my brain unable to process what my eyes were seeing. Jim was the same way. Later, we'd beat ourselves up about not taking pictures, but in that moment, we were just too stunned to think clearly. When the creature reached the edge of the bluff, it stopped. The drop to the creek below had to be at least 30 feet. In my mind, I thought it would turn and follow the edge to find a way down. It didn't. Without hesitation, this massive being just leapt off the edge, disappearing from our sight. Just jumped right off like it was stepping off a curb. Holy shit! Jim finally broke the silence. Did that just happen? I couldn't answer. My mouth felt like it was full of sand. We sat there for a long time, neither of us moving. The only sound was our breathing and the occasional distant call of a bird. Finally, Jim stood up. "We should go look," he said. "See if there's any tracks or something." Part of me wanted to just pack up and get the hell out of there. But another part, the part that had to know, had to confirm what we'd seen, agreed with Jim. It took us about 45 minutes to work our way down to where we'd seen the creature. We moved cautiously, our rifles ready, though I'm not sure what good they would have done if we'd come face to face with that thing. When we reached the grassy slope, we searched for tracks. The ground was mostly hard and rocky, but in a few spots where there was softer soil, we found them. Footprints, but not human footprints. These were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and shaped all wrong. They had 5 toes like a human print, but the proportions were off. The heel was wider, the arch higher, and they were deep. Whatever made those prints was heavy. We followed them to the edge of the bluff. Below was Cabola Creek, rushing over rocks. On the other side was dense forest. We scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. "It jumped down there," Jim said, peering over the edge. "No way anything survives that drop." But there were no signs of a body below, just the creek and the forest beyond. We decided not to continue our hunt. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both felt the same thing. We weren't welcome there anymore. We made camp about 2 miles away, closer to the trailhead than we'd planned. That night, we barely slept. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the darkness had us sitting up, listening. The next morning, we packed up and hiked out. We talked about what we'd seen the whole way back to the truck. We tried to come up with explanations. A man in a costume, in the middle of nowhere. A bear, with a disease that made it walk upright, with that face, those eyes. Some undiscovered animal, 7 feet tall. Nothing fit. I couldn't stop thinking about it. For years, it haunted me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. The image of that creature burned into my mind. The way it moved. Those eyes Jim described. Finally, in 1990, 7 years after our encounter, I went back. I went alone. Jim refused to return. I didn't blame him. I hiked back to that same ridge, set up camp, and spent 3 days exploring the area. I found something on the second day that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing not far from where we'd seen the creature, I found rocks. Not scattered naturally, but deliberately stacked in small towers. The earth beneath them had been disturbed recently. It looked like someone had dug into the soil with their hands, not tools. But what really got to me was what I found in a grove of young aspen trees nearby. Several of the trees had been snapped off about 5 feet above the ground. Not cut, not chewed by beavers, snapped, with the broken ends frayed and torn. The broken branches showed signs of having been eaten, but not in any way I recognized from deer or elk or even bears. The bark had been stripped in long, clean pulls, and the tender parts beneath had teeth marks that were all wrong, too big, too widely spaced. I went back one more time in 1992. I brought a camera this time, determined to document anything I found. In almost the same spot, I found a single footprint in mud near a small spring. It was just like the ones we'd seen years before, huge, shaped wrong, with 5 distinct toes. I took pictures, measured it against my boot. It was 17 inches long. I never went back after that. I didn't need to. I know what I saw that day in October, even if I don't have a name for it. Most people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I just call it the creature from Powderhorn. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I can't explain how something that size could just disappear into the wilderness without a trace. I can't explain those yellow-orange eyes, or why it would stack rocks or snap aspen trees. All I know is what I saw, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still see it in my mind. That massive, powerful creature walking across that slope, those impossibly long arms, that deliberate gait. And then, without hesitation, leaping off that bluff into nothing. The wilderness feels different to me now, bigger, stranger, full of possibilities I never considered before that day. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into the neat categories we've created. I know because I saw one, and sometimes I think it saw me too. Story 2. I've never really talked about this before, not in detail anyway. I'm still trying to process what happened that day in Idaho. Even though it was 20 years ago, I was just 11 years old. But the memory is burned into my brain like it happened yesterday. It was early summer when my mom's ex-boyfriend decided to take me fly fishing. I was excited. I'd never been fly fishing before, and even though things were awkward between us, him and my mom had only broken up a few months earlier, I was looking forward to the trip. We drove up to this remote spot in Idaho that he said had the best trout fishing in the state. The campsite was beautiful, right near this crystal-clear river with mountains all around. I remember him shaking me awake while it was still dark. "Time to get up, kiddo. Best fishing is at dawn," he whispered. I was groggy, but excited. The tent was cold, and I could hear the soft patter of rain on the nylon. I remember thinking it was weird to go fishing in the rain, but he insisted that's when the fish bite best. We packed some granola bars and water bottles and headed out. It was that strange pre-dawn light where everything looks grey and washed out. The drizzle wasn't heavy, just enough to make everything damp and miserable. My rain jacket was too big, a hand-me-down from my older cousin, and kept slipping off my shoulders as we hiked. When we got to the river, there wasn't another soul around. No surprise with the weather. The river was wider than I expected, maybe 30 yards across, with dense forest on both sides. The water was moving fast from the rain, and I remember being a little scared of falling in. He showed me the basics of casting, but I was terrible at it. My line kept getting tangled, and I could tell he was getting frustrated with me, though he tried not to show it. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour, the sun barely breaking through the clouds, when I first noticed it. I was looking across the river, honestly bored and tired of failing at fishing, when something moved on the ridge on the opposite bank, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a tree branch moving in the wind. But then it moved again. "Hey," I said, tugging on his sleeve. "What's that?" He was focused on his fishing line, muttering something about a snag. "What's what?" "Over there on the ridge." He glanced up briefly, probably just a deer or something. "Focus on your cast." But it wasn't a deer. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a figure hunched over on the ridge. It was hard to see clearly through the drizzle and dim light, but it looked wrong. Sometimes it seemed like an ape, sometimes more like a man, but not really either. It had patches of grey and white hair all over its body, like an old dog. It wasn't fully standing upright, but it wasn't on all fours either, just watching us. I remember the cold feeling that washed over me. Not fear, not yet, but this deep unease, like when you realize someone's been standing behind you for a while and you didn't notice. "I really think you should look," I said, my voice cracking, but something strange was happening. Every time I looked over at my mom's ex-boyfriend, his eyes seemed glazed over. He'd stop mid-sentence, staring blankly at his fishing rod or the water. It was like he was in a trance or something. I'd shake his arm, and he'd snap out of it for a second, look around confused, then drift back into whatever he was doing. "There's something over there," I insisted, getting scared now. "Just focus on fishing," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. I kept glancing back at the creature. It hadn't moved much, just shifted position occasionally, always keeping its eyes on us. I could feel it watching us, studying us. The longer I looked, the more details I could make out. Its face was almost human-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The jaw was too heavy, the brow too pronounced, and the eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark, but somehow caught what little light there was. Intelligent, ancient. For maybe 20 minutes, this standoff continued. Me watching it watching us, and my mom's ex-boyfriend oblivious, caught in whatever spell the thing had cast on him. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast and gloomy. Then everything changed in an instant. The creature's demeanor shifted. 1 second, it was calmly observing us. The next, it was in a frenzy. It threw its long, impossibly long arms over its head and started making these sounds, not quite howls, not quite screams, hooting and hollering that echoed across the river valley. The sounds didn't seem to match its mouth movements, like the noise was coming from somewhere else entirely. I was frozen in place, my fishing rod forgotten in my hands. The creature was moving now, pacing back and forth on the ridge, its movements jerky and aggressive. Then, to my absolute horror, it positioned itself at the edge of the ridge, facing us directly, and began urinating off the cliff toward us. The smell hit me seconds later. It's impossible to describe adequately, like a dead skunk that had been baking on hot pavement for days, mixed with rotten meat and something chemical and wrong. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. I dropped my fishing rod and doubled over, retching. That finally snapped my mom's ex-boyfriend out of his trance. "What the hell is that smell?" he gasped, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve. I pointed across the river, still gagging. "Look, there!" He looked, really looked, for the first time. His face went completely white. "Holy shit," he whispered, and then the creature jumped. It didn't hesitate, it just launched itself off the ridge and into the river with a massive splash. The transformation was instant and terrifying. On land, it had seemed bulky and almost clumsy. In the water, it was like watching a seal or an otter, lean, agile, perfectly adapted. It moved through the current like it wasn't even there, its powerful arms cutting through the water, coming straight for us. My mum's ex-boyfriend completely lost it. He dropped everything, his fishing rod, his tackle box, everything, and started running back toward the trail. He didn't say a word to me, didn't tell me to run, didn't grab my hand, nothing. He just ran. I stood there, paralyzed for a few seconds, watching the creature swim toward our side of the river. It was moving fast, but staying mostly underwater. I could just see the top of its head, those eyes still locked on me. Then self-preservation kicked in. I turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, following the path my mom's ex-boyfriend had taken. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of splashing water behind me was enough to fuel my legs to move faster than they ever had before. The trail back to camp seemed 10 times longer than it had that morning. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. I kept slipping on the muddy ground, scraping my hands and knees, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whole time I was running, I could hear it, not just behind me anymore, but somehow all around me, screaming. That's the only word for it, though it wasn't a human scream. It was higher, more guttural, like something between a howl and a roar, with this strange, almost musical quality underneath. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees. I remember thinking with absolute certainty that I was going to die, that this thing, whatever it was toying with me, that it could catch me any time it wanted, but it was enjoying the chase. When I finally broke through the trees and saw our campsite, I nearly collapsed with relief. The car was there, engine already running, doors closed. I could see my mom's ex-boyfriend inside, his face a mask of terror behind the windshield. I sprinted the last few yards to the car, yanking at the passenger door. It was locked. I screamed, pounding on the window. For one horrible moment, I thought he was going to drive away without me. His eyes met mine, and there was something in them I'd never seen before, raw, animal fear that had overridden everything else. Finally, he reached over and unlocked the door. I dove inside, slamming it behind me and locking it immediately. "Go! Go!" I screamed. He didn't need to be told twice. He floored it, tires spinning in the mud before catching. We fishtailed onto the dirt road, leaving our tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, everything behind. We drove in complete silence for maybe 20 minutes. My heart was still pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept looking in the side mirror, expecting to see the creature chasing after us. Finally, when we hit the main road, he spoke. "We don't tell your mum what happened," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We just say we saw a bear, got spooked, left our stuff. Okay?" I nodded, still too terrified to speak. And that's exactly what we told her, that we'd seen a bear, panicked, and left everything behind. She was upset about the expensive camping gear, but relieved we were okay. She assumed it was just some normal wilderness encounter, a bear or mountain lion that had wandered too close to our campsite. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen in books or documentaries. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, that horrible smell, none of that matches any known animal. I've never spoken to my mom's ex-boyfriend about it again. They broke up for good a few months after the trip, and I haven't seen him since. Part of me wishes I could talk to him now, as an adult, to compare memories. But another part thinks he'd probably pretend not to remember, too embarrassed about how he abandoned an 11-year-old kid to save himself. Sometimes I think about going back to that spot in Idaho, just to see if there's any evidence of what we encountered. But then I remember those eyes watching me from across the river, and that awful scream echoing through the trees, and I know I never will. Some things are better left alone. Story 3. I've been struggling with whether to share this for years now. I'm not one for making up tall tales or seeking attention. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm about as straightforward as they come. But what happened to me back in May of 2012 has haunted me ever since, and I just need to get it off my chest. I'm 54 years old, born and raised in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I've been fishing Lake Ouachita since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. My dad took me there, and his dad took him there. That lake is like a second home to me. I know every cove, every good fishing spot, every change in depth. At least I thought I did. May 20th started like any other fishing day. I woke up before the sun, packed my gear, and headed out. The weather was perfect. Not too hot yet, with that early summer feel where everything smells green and alive. I launched my old aluminum boat from a public access ramp near one of the quieter coves on the east side of the lake. It's not one of the popular spots where families go swimming or where the fancy bass boats congregate. Just a simple gravel ramp leading into a peaceful stretch of water. I had my tackle box, my favorite rod, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket with an aerator for my live bait. I'd caught some nice fat shiners the day before and was hoping they'd entice a few big bass. The lake was calm that morning, with just a light mist rising off the surface as the sun started to warm things up. For about 2 hours I just drifted and cast, enjoying the solitude. Caught a couple of small ones, nothing worth keeping, but that wasn't really the point. Being out there on the water as the world wakes up, that's the real reason I go. Around 8 in the morning, I decided to take a break. My thermos of coffee was calling my name, and I needed to stretch my legs a bit. I pulled the boat up on a little sandy stretch of shore in a secluded cove. There wasn't another soul around. No boats, no cabins visible, just trees and water and sky. I set my rod down against a rock, made sure the bait bucket was situated near the water's edge so the shiners would stay cool, and walked maybe 30 yards up into the trees to take care of business. I remember being extra careful not to go too far, because you never know when another boat might come by, but the trees were thick enough to give me privacy. Couldn't have been gone more than 2 or 3 minutes. When I came back down toward the shore, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My bait bucket wasn't standing upright where I'd left it. It was lying on its side, the contents spilled out onto the dirt and rocks. At first I thought maybe I'd left it unbalanced and it had tipped over. But as I got closer, I could see that wasn't the case at all. The lid was cracked and bent outward, like someone had pried it off with force. Several of my shiners were flopping helplessly in the dirt, dying in the open air, but most were just gone. I knelt down to inspect the damage, and that's when a chill ran up my spine. The bucket hadn't just fallen over. It had been deliberately opened. The lid wasn't gnawed or clawed at like a raccoon or otter might do. It was smashed, with what looked like a deep impression in the center, as if something had pressed down with tremendous force to pop it open. As I was taking this in, I heard it, heavy footsteps, methodical, unhurried, moving away from me, up the slope of the bank. The sound alone made my heart skip. These weren't the light, scampering steps of a small animal. These were heavy, deliberate footfalls that made the ground seem to vibrate slightly, like someone very large, walking with purpose. I turned my head toward the sound, looking up the gentle slope toward the tree line about 40 yards away. That's when I saw it. I've replayed this moment in my mind thousands of times since that day. I've questioned what I saw, tried to rationalize it, told myself it could have been a bear, a trick of the light, anything but what I know I actually witnessed. There was a massive figure walking steadily uphill, its back turned to me. It was moving upright on 2 legs in a way that no bear could manage. The shoulders were impossibly broad, easily twice the width of a large man's, and it was covered head to toe in dark, shaggy hair that rippled and swayed with each step it took. The height is what I remember most vividly. Using the surrounding trees for scale, this thing was easily over 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Its head had a distinctive conical shape, sloping into what appeared to be a heavy brow ridge. The hair covering its body wasn't a uniform color. It was primarily dark brown, almost black in some places, but with noticeable lighter patches near its shoulders, almost a reddish brown in the morning sunlight. Its body was massively built, barrel-chested, with visible muscles working beneath the thick hair as it moved. Its arms swung long and low at its sides, proportionally longer than a human's would be. And its stride, God, its stride. Each step covered more ground than any human could possibly manage. It moved with a fluidity that was both graceful and terrifying. I froze. Completely froze. I couldn't have called out or made a sound even if I'd wanted to. My mouth went dry and my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. Even though the creature hadn't turned toward me or made any aggressive move, I felt an overwhelming sense of primal fear wash over me. The smashed bucket at my feet was proof that this thing had been close, far closer than I ever wanted it to be. While I was just a short distance away in the trees, it had approached my boat, inspected my bait bucket, and helped itself to the contents. How long had it been watching me before I left the shoreline? Had it been tracking me all morning? Had it waited patiently for me to walk away before approaching? Did it somehow know what was inside the bucket? As these questions raced through my mind, the creature reached the tree line and, without a backward glance, disappeared into the dense forest. The entire sighting couldn't have lasted more than 15 or 20 seconds, but it felt like time had stretched out forever. Once it was gone from sight, my paralysis broke. I didn't waste a second. I abandoned the flopping shiners, grabbed my rod, and scrambled into my boat, pushing off from shore with such force that I nearly fell backward into the water. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the motor, but when it caught, I gunned it toward open water, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was in the middle of the lake, far from any shoreline. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept scanning the shoreline, half expecting to see that massive figure emerge from the trees again, but there was nothing. After about 30 minutes of sitting in open water, my breathing finally started to return to normal. I decided to head back to the boat ramp. I wasn't going to fish anymore that day. Hell, I wasn't sure I'd ever want to fish that lake again. Back at the ramp, with my boat safely loaded on my trailer, I examined what remained of my bait bucket more closely. The damage was even more unsettling in the full light of day. The lid had a deep crack right across the center that looked as if it had been struck with immense force. The aerator hose was torn loose completely. The sides of the bucket were dented in a way that no small animal could possibly manage. I've spent countless hours since that day trying to make sense of what I saw. I've researched bears, considered the possibility of a hoax, even wondered if stress or lack of sleep might have caused me to misinterpret something ordinary, but none of these explanations fit. The damage to the bucket was real. The heavy footsteps I heard were real. The sight of that towering creature walking upright into the forest was real. For me, the event erased all doubt. I saw a Bigfoot. I'm absolutely certain of it. What troubles me most, even now, all these years later, is how close it had been. If it was bold enough to approach within yards of me to take my bait, what stopped it from coming closer? Was it merely curious? Was it hungry? Or was it something else entirely? I've returned to Lake Ouachita many times since then. I still fish there occasionally, though never alone and never in that particular cove. I can't help scanning the tree line whenever I'm near the shore, wondering if I'm being watched. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, a couple of close friends. Most people would think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but I know what I saw, and the image of that massive hair-covered figure disappearing into the trees is burned into my memory forever. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just putting this out there because keeping it to myself for so long has been its own kind of burden. Whatever was at Lake Ouachita that morning in May, whatever took my bait and left those massive footprints, it was real and it's out there still. Story 4. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened back in the summer of '66, or maybe it was '67. The years blur together now, but what I saw will never fade from my memory. I've never written this down before, but I need to get it off my chest. I grew up in the Dalles, Oregon, nice little town on the Columbia River, surrounded by hills and forests. It was a great place to be a teenager, safe enough that we could walk around at night without our parents freaking out. At least that's what we thought before that night. My buddy David and I were walking home with a few other friends after hanging out downtown. It was probably around 10 at night, dark but with a decent moon. We were taking our usual shortcut that went along this hillside, with another path running parallel about 20 feet above us, just goofing around, talking about school and girls like normal kids. That's when I first noticed something was off. There were footsteps above us on that upper path. Heavy ones, not like a deer or a dog. They sounded deliberate, like someone walking, but heavier than any person I'd ever heard. "You guys hear that?" I whispered. Everyone got quiet. Thump, thump, thump. We all looked at each other. Nobody needed to say anything. Something was following us. Here's the thing that really freaked me out. When we slowed down our walking, whatever was up there slowed down too. When we sped up, it matched our pace exactly. It was tracking us, hunting us. We walked faster, trying not to panic. The footsteps above kept perfect time. Then we stopped dead in our tracks. The footsteps took 2 more steps and then silence. For maybe 30 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then we heard it. Something was rushing down the slope toward us, not carefully anymore, but charging. I'll never forget what I saw next. This thing burst through some brush at the edge of our path. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8 or 9. In the dim light, I could make out a huge silhouette, broad-shouldered and covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It stood upright like a man, but not a man. The weirdest part? It didn't make any noise except for its footsteps. No growling, no breathing, nothing. It just stood there for a second, swaying slightly, almost like it was sizing us up or I don't know, mocking us. That's when we broke. We all turned and ran like hell toward the main road. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like rubber, but pure fear kept me moving. I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind at any moment. We hit the main road just as a car was coming around the bend. Its headlights swept across the hillside, and I swear to God, they caught another one of these things. Just for a second, the lights illuminated this massive figure standing upright among the trees, broad, hairy, and watching us. Then the car passed, and it was gone. The driver must have seen our panic because he stopped and rolled down his window. "You boys okay?" We were babbling, pointing at the hillside, trying to explain. The guy probably thought we were drunk or on drugs. He offered us a ride, and we all crammed into his car. We directed him to this little motel nearby where one of our other friends was staying with his older brother. After we got there and calmed down a bit, David said what we were all thinking. That was a Bigfoot, had to be. I'd heard stories about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest my whole life, but I'd always thought they were just campfire tales. Now I wasn't so sure. We convinced a few more guys at the motel to come back with us. Safety in numbers, right? Plus, nobody really believed us. They thought we were playing a prank. So about 7 of us piled into 2 cars and drove back to the area. We parked by the road and walked up the path with flashlights. Everyone was talking tough, but I could tell we were all on edge. We spread out a bit, scanning the trees and undergrowth. That's when one of the guys shouted, "There, look!" About 50 yards away, between some trees, was one of them just standing there, watching. As soon as our flashlights hit it, it took off up the hill. A couple of the guys tried to chase it, but it was insanely fast. It covered ground like nothing I've ever seen. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the darkness. We searched for another hour but found nothing, just some broken branches and what might have been footprints, but it was too dark to tell for sure. The next night we came back with more people. We searched the same area but saw nothing. Everyone was starting to think David and I had made the whole thing up or exaggerated what we'd seen. I was beginning to doubt myself too. Maybe it had been a bear standing on its hind legs, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. On the 3rd night, David brought his dad's shotgun. I remember being nervous about that, but also relieved. We were a smaller group this time, just 5 of us. We'd been searching for about an hour when we heard that same heavy footstep sound from the first night. Thump, thump, thump. It was circling us, playing with us. Sometimes the sound would come from one direction, then suddenly from another. We stuck close together, flashlights sweeping frantically through the trees. Then it appeared, just like before, this massive dark shape moving between the trees about 30 yards away. David raised the shotgun. "David, wait," I started to say, but he fired. Boom! The sound echoed through the hills. The creature stumbled backward and fell. For a second, we all just stood there in shock. David had actually hit it, but then the impossible happened. It got up. It got up like it had just tripped, not like it had taken a shotgun blast. And then it ran, straight toward a barbed wire fence that separated the hillside from a farm field. What happened next still haunts me. This thing hit that fence at full speed and went right through it. The wooden fence posts, thick, pressure-treated posts sunk deep in the ground, snapped like they were twigs. The barbed wire itself tore like it was string. The raw power it took to do that, it wasn't natural. We heard it crashing through the brush beyond the fence, and then it was gone. Nobody said anything for a long time. We were all trying to process what we'd just seen. The next morning we went back in daylight. We found footprints, actual, clear footprints in the soft dirt. I measured them with my hand. They were huge, around 48 centimeters long and 20 centimeters wide. The prints were deep too, pressed hard into the ground like whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. We followed the tracks to the fence. 3 posts were broken clean off at ground level. Beyond, we could see where something heavy had crashed through the underbrush. but the ground was too rocky to hold more footprints. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my window made me freeze. I kept replaying that night in my head, the way it moved, the way it watched us, the way it broke through that fence like it was nothing. The following June in '67, David and I managed to convince a larger group to go back. This time, we meant business. 12 men, most with hunting experience, armed with high-caliber rifles and shotguns. We were determined to prove what we'd seen was real. We spent all day scouring that hillside. It was a hot day, and by mid-afternoon, most of the guys were ready to call it quits. They'd started making jokes about wild goose chases and David's and my overactive imaginations. That's when one of the men suddenly raised his hand for silence. He pointed to a dense patch of trees about 60 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the branches moving slightly, not with the wind, but like something was adjusting its position. We spread out, moving carefully toward the spot. As we got closer, I began to make out a shape behind the branches. It was crouched down, trying to hide, but even hunched over it was still about 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair or fur. One of the men, a hunter named Bill, who'd been the most skeptical of our story, raised his shotgun. The creature must have realized it had been spotted because it suddenly stood up to its full height. It was enormous. Bill fired twice, both shots hitting it square in the chest. The creature staggered backward but didn't fall. It turned and ran, right toward another fence. Just like before, it crashed through, breaking 3 fence posts clean at ground level. The raw strength it took to do that. I've never seen anything like it before or since. We followed as best we could, but it was too fast. Bill was white as a sheet. "I hit it," he kept saying. "I hit it dead center." The next day we went back and found blood, actual blood, marking a trail through the underbrush. We followed it for about 100 yards and then nothing. The blood trail just stopped, like whatever was bleeding had suddenly been lifted off the ground. Or maybe it had somehow stopped bleeding all at once, which seemed impossible given the wounds it must have had. We searched for hours, but found no more blood, no more tracks, nothing. It had vanished. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened those nights. I've read every book on Bigfoot I could find, followed every news story about sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Some details match what we experienced, but nothing that explains the sheer power of these creatures or how they could absorb shotgun blasts and keep moving. I haven't been back to those hills since. I couldn't if I wanted to. They've built houses there now. Sometimes I wonder if those families ever hear heavy footsteps at night, pacing around their homes. Sometimes I wonder if whatever we encountered is still out there, watching from the trees. All I know for certain is what I saw. And no matter how many years pass, I still check my windows before I go to bed. Some fears never leave you. Story 5. I've been holding this in for so long, and I need to get it off my chest. This happened to me back in July of 1975. I was 22 at the time. It's been almost 50 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats some nights thinking about it. 4 of us had decided to go camping on this small, mostly uninhabited island off the coast. It wasn't a tourist spot or anything, just a chunk of wilderness that locals sometimes visited for day trips or overnight camping. My buddy Tom had an uncle with a small boat who'd drop us off and pick us up a few days later. We were all college students, looking for some adventure before heading back for the fall semester. The first day went exactly as you'd expect. We set up camp, had some beers, fished a bit, nothing unusual. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a light breeze coming off the water. We'd hiked around part of the island and found it was mostly dense forest, with some rocky areas near the shore. There weren't any official trails, just game paths, and the occasional area where other campers had clearly walked before. On our second day, we decided to explore deeper into the island's interior. We'd packed some sandwiches and water and planned to be out most of the day. The island wasn't huge. You could probably walk across it in a couple hours if you went in a straight line, but the terrain was pretty rough in spots, and we wanted to take our time. About 2 hours into our hike, we came to this small clearing surrounded by these really thick old trees. The canopy above was dense, so it was noticeably cooler and darker in this spot. We were all talking and joking around, nothing serious, when Tom just stopped dead in his tracks and grabbed my arm. I still remember how hard he squeezed, left bruises that lasted for days. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a bear. It was crouched down at the far end of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away. But something wasn't right. The proportions were all wrong. And then it shifted slightly, and I realized it was eating something. There were feathers scattered around. It had a bird in its hands, a big one, maybe a seagull or something. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out more details, and my stomach just dropped. This thing was covered in long black hair, not fur but hair, from head to toe. It had this weirdly shaped head, kind of domed at the top, with these tiny ears that sat flat against its skull. And when it turned toward us, God, its eyes, they were red, not like bloodshot, but actually red, catching what little light filtered through the trees. None of us moved. We couldn't. I don't think we were even breathing. It's like our bodies knew instinctively that any movement might set this thing off. It noticed us, though. It froze for a second, then slowly stood up. It was shorter than I expected, maybe 5 feet tall, but stocky and powerful looking. It dropped what was left of the bird, and this low growl came from it. Not like a dog growl, deeper, more. I don't know how to describe it. It vibrated in my chest. The smell hit us then. I've worked on farms, I've cleaned out garbage dumps as summer jobs. I've smelled dead animals on the roadside. Nothing comes close to this. It was like something rotting mixed with wet animal fur that hadn't dried in months, plus something else I can't even describe. So strong it made my eyes water and triggered my gag reflex. At this point, Dave, always the impulsive one, started slowly backing away. The thing's head snapped toward him, tracking his movement. Then the weirdest thing happened. It started moving, but not like a person or an animal I've ever seen. It was upright on 2 legs, but then it would suddenly shift into this sideways crab-like motion, incredibly fast, only to stand upright again. It was like its joints worked differently than ours. The movement was fluid, but wrong. So wrong. I've never felt terror like that before or since. It was primal. My body recognized the danger before my brain could even process what I was seeing. I couldn't look away, but everything in me was screaming to run. When it moved toward us, we broke. All 4 of us just turned and ran like hell. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. My body just did it. The forest was dense, and I kept slamming into branches and tripping over roots. My shin hit a fallen log so hard I still have a scar, but I didn't even feel it at the time. I could hear the others crashing through the undergrowth nearby and quick, heavy footsteps behind us. The sound didn't match a human gait. It was too irregular, sometimes quick pattering steps, sometimes heavier thumps. And the whole time, that stench followed us, like it was clinging to our clothes. We eventually broke out onto a small beach area. I risked a glance back and saw nothing following us, but the tree line looked dark and threatening. We were all gasping for air, unable to speak at first. Mike's face was scratched up from branches, and Tom had lost his glasses somewhere in the forest. Dave was bent over, hands on his knees, looking like he might throw up. "What the fuck was that?" Dave finally managed to say between breaths. None of us had an answer. We stayed on that beach for at least an hour, too scared to move back into the trees. We debated trying to signal for help, but our ride wasn't coming back until the next day, and we had no way to contact anyone. Cell phones weren't a thing back then, obviously. Eventually, we realized we had to go back. Our camp was on the other side of the island, and all our supplies were there, but none of us wanted to go through the forest again. We decided to try to make our way around the shoreline, even though parts of it were rocky and difficult to navigate. It took us over 4 hours to reach our campsite, and by then, the sun was starting to set. The whole time, I kept looking back over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched. The hair on the back of my neck just wouldn't settle down. When we got back to camp, nothing had been disturbed, which was a small relief. We immediately started packing up, all silently agreeing that we weren't spending another night on that island. But it was already getting dark, and we knew we couldn't navigate the water safely at night, especially in our state of mind. So we built the biggest fire we could and sat around it, backs to each other, facing outward. None of us slept. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. The darkness beyond our fire seemed to pulse with potential threats. Around midnight, we started hearing noises from the forest edge, branches breaking, undergrowth rustling. Too deliberate to be the wind, too irregular to be an animal like a deer. Something was circling our camp, staying just out of the firelight, and that smell would occasionally waft over us, making us gag. At one point, Mike whispered, "Guys, look," pointing toward a gap between 2 trees. I swear I saw those red eyes reflecting our firelight, watching us. They blinked once, slowly, then disappeared. Just before dawn, when the sky was starting to lighten slightly, Dave said he needed to take a leak. None of us wanted to go into the woods alone, so we all went together, staying within a few feet of each other. That's when we saw them. Footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of our clearing. They were nothing like I've ever seen before or since. Large, bigger than my hand, with 6 toes splayed out wide. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. They didn't match any animal I know of, and definitely weren't human. We followed them for a short distance, and they seemed to change. Sometimes showing 5 toes, sometimes 6, like the creature's feet were shifting somehow. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up everything and headed for our pickup point, taking the beach route again, even though it was longer. Tom's uncle arrived around 9, and he immediately asked what was wrong. Apparently, we all looked like hell. We didn't tell him. What could we say that wouldn't sound completely insane? On the boat ride back, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of escaped zoo animal. Maybe we'd all somehow hallucinated the same thing, though we knew that was impossible. When we got back to the mainland, we promised each other we wouldn't talk about it with anyone else. Who would believe us? But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I felt in that moment when it locked eyes with me. I've researched over the years, trying to find anything similar. I've read accounts of Bigfoot sightings, but they never quite match. This wasn't 8 feet tall and humanoid. It was smaller, more alien in its movements and features. The 6-toed prints don't match any known cryptid reports I've found. I've never gone camping again. I can't even bring myself to hike in dense forests anymore. That feeling of being watched, that sense of encountering something that shouldn't exist in our world, it never really leaves you. The others? We drifted apart after that summer. It was like we couldn't look at each other without remembering. Tom moved across the country. Mike became religious, oddly enough. Dave's the only one I still occasionally talk to, though we never discuss the island. I still can't explain what we saw that day. Sometimes I almost convince myself it wasn't real, but then I'll catch a certain smell, rotting vegetation or wet dog, and it all comes flooding back. The red eyes, the impossible movement, the footprints that shouldn't exist. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be there, and I wasn't supposed to see it. I think about those 6-toed footprints a lot. I wonder if it's still there on that island, watching from the trees as other unsuspecting people venture into its territory. Story 6. I was heading back home after spending the afternoon at my friend's ranch a few miles away. The sun was setting, probably around 8 in the evening. The temperature was dropping, and there was that crisp autumn feeling in the air. Just a typical fall evening in the rural countryside. At least that's how it started. My horse, Jasper, is about the most level-headed gelding you'll ever meet. He's seen deer, coyotes, even had a run-in with a black bear once, and he barely flinched. Nothing spooked that horse. That's why what happened next caught me completely off guard. We were following this old dirt road that cuts through a stretch of pine forest. There's a small creek that runs through the property with an old wooden plank bridge crossing over it. I'd crossed that bridge hundreds of times without incident. As we got about 50 yards from the bridge, Jasper's behavior completely changed. He started prancing sideways, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring. I could feel his muscles tensing underneath me. At first, I thought maybe he'd spotted a coyote or something, but this was different. He kept snorting and fixating on something to our left, toward the denser part of the woods. I remember trying to calm him down, patting his neck, saying, "Easy boy, what's wrong?" But he wouldn't settle. That's when I noticed his mane. Parts of it were literally standing on end, not just raised a little, but actually standing up. I'd never seen anything like it. Almost simultaneously, I felt this weird sensation on my own skin. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. It wasn't from the cold. It was something else, like electricity in the air or something. I've heard people talk about that feeling when something's not right, but I'd never experienced it myself until then. There was a steady wind at our backs, maybe 10 miles per hour, rustling the trees. Nothing unusual about that, but somehow it made everything feel more exposed, more vulnerable, like something downwind could sense us coming. I urged Jasper forward, wanting to cross that bridge and get home. He reluctantly moved ahead, still acting skittish, still focused on the left side of the trail. We made it across the bridge, the hollow sound of his hooves on those wooden planks echoing through the trees. And that's when the trail opened up a bit into a small meadow. I'll never forget what I saw standing there. 2 figures, not people, definitely not people. They were standing side by side at the edge of the meadow, about 35 yards away, just beyond a barbed wire fence that separated the meadow from the forest. They were just watching us, completely still except for a strange swaying motion, like they were shifting their weight from foot to foot. The taller one must have been 7 or 8 feet tall at least. The shorter one was still massive, taller than any person I've ever seen, maybe 6.5 feet. But it wasn't just their height. Their proportions were all wrong. Their shoulders were too broad, their arms too long. They were covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. I couldn't make out facial features in the fading light, but I could feel them watching me. The way they moved was so unsettling. They were slowly swaying back and forth, and I suddenly realized they were trying to catch our scent. The wind was at our backs, blowing toward them. They were smelling us. I've never felt terror like that before. My entire body went cold. I couldn't even scream. My throat just closed up. Jasper was trembling beneath me, and I knew he wanted to bolt. For a few seconds, I was too paralyzed with fear to even move. Then some survival instinct kicked in. I dug my heels into Jasper's sides, probably harder than I should have, and he took off like a shot. I didn't need to tell him twice. He galloped faster than he'd ever run before, and I just hunched over his neck, holding onto his mane for dear life. About 100 yards down the trail, I couldn't help myself. I looked back. They were walking toward the tree line on 2 legs, completely upright like humans, but with this strange, fluid motion that no human has. Step by step, they disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The taller one looked back once, and even though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt it looking right through me. I didn't slow Jasper down until we reached the main road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the reins. When I finally got home, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool evening. I unsaddled Jasper, put him in his stall, and went straight into the house, locking every door and window. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. I told myself maybe it was just people playing a prank, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. But deep down, I knew better. The worst part is, that wasn't the end of it. 2 months later, in December, I was walking my hunting dogs along the same general area just before dusk. I'd almost convinced myself that what happened before was just my imagination running wild. Almost. I was about a quarter mile from that same bridge when I felt it again. That prickling sensation on my skin, the hair standing up on my arms. The air felt heavy, charged somehow. My dogs, who had been happily trotting ahead of me, suddenly stopped. Their ears perked up and they started whining, not barking, but this high-pitched, nervous whine I'd never heard from them before. Then they bolted. Both of them just took off running back toward home. These were trained hunting dogs that had never run off before, and they just abandoned me there. I called after them, but they kept running until they disappeared from sight. That's when I smelled it. This overwhelming, musky, sour odor. People sometimes compare it to skunk smell, but it wasn't that exactly. It was more primitive, more animal, but not like any animal I've ever encountered. It hung in the air, particularly strong in the low areas where the trail dipped down. I felt like I was being watched, not just watched, hunted. I started walking faster, then jogging, then flat out running. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see those figures again, but the forest had grown too dark to see much of anything. The entire way home, I could hear something moving through the underbrush parallel to the trail. Something big that didn't care about making noise. It would stop when I stopped, move when I moved. It was following me. When I finally broke out of the tree line near my property, the sounds stopped. I didn't slow down until I was inside with the doors locked. My dogs were huddled on the porch, still trembling. They wouldn't go back outside until morning. I've researched everything I could about what I might have seen that night. I've read accounts from people who've had similar experiences. I know what people call them, but saying the name feels like it makes it more real, and I'm not ready for that. I still live in the same house. I still ride Jasper, but we take different routes now. I haven't gone back to that bridge or that section of woods. Sometimes at night, especially when the wind is strong, I think I can smell that same musky odor, even with the windows closed. I've installed better security lights around the property. I keep the blinds closed after dark. The rational part of my brain tells me I'm overreacting, but then I remember the way those figures moved, the impossible height, the wrongness of their proportions, and I check the locks one more time. The strangest thing is how it changes you. Knowing something's out there that shouldn't exist. You start noticing things you never did before. The way the birds suddenly go silent in the middle of the day, the unexplained tracks in the mud after a rain, the feeling of being watched when you're alone. I don't have an explanation for what I saw that evening. I don't want one, really. Some things are better left unknown. All I know is that I wasn't the first person to see them, and I doubt I'll be the last. The woods are deeper and older than we realize, and sometimes when the light is fading and the wind is right, they reveal their secrets to people who aren't prepared for them. I still ride, I still hunt, I still live my life, but I never ever stay out after dusk anymore. Story 7. I've never really told this story in detail to anyone outside my family. It's been almost 60 years now. But what happened that day in 1964 is burned into my memory like it was yesterday. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was a warm day in May of '64. I was 14 years old, and my Aunt Marge had invited me and 2 of her friends to go fishing near Old Bayshore Road in Cape Coral. I was excited because I didn't get to go fishing much, and it felt grown up to be included with the women. We arrived mid-morning when the sun was already hot. The air smelled like salt and mud, and those little no-see-ums were already starting to bite. The 4 of us spread out along the bank of what was basically a wide canal that fed into the bay. I remember I was wearing these old denim shorts and a faded t-shirt that had been washed so many times you could barely make out the Mickey Mouse on it anymore. I wandered a bit farther down the bank than the others, maybe 50 yards or so. I liked having my own space, and there was a fallen cypress log that made a perfect seat. The water was calm that day, almost still, with just the occasional ripple when a fish would surface. I had my rod propped up on a forked stick I'd pushed into the mud, and I was just sitting there waiting, listening to the distant chatter of the women. That's when I felt it. You know that feeling when you're alone but suddenly you don't feel alone anymore, like the air gets heavier or something. I can't explain it exactly, but something made me look up from the water toward the tree line behind me. The woods there weren't super thick, mostly scrubby palms, some pines, and lots of palmetto bushes. At first, I just caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Nothing unusual about that. Could be a deer, a raccoon, whatever. But when I turned my head to look properly, I froze. About 30 yards away, something was moving between the trees. My first thought was, that's a bear. We didn't have many bears in that area, but it was big and dark. But then it moved again, and I realized it wasn't moving like a bear at all. It was crouched down, picking at something on the ground. From that position, it looked almost like a huge man hunched over. Its whole body was covered in what looked like black or dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair. Long hair. It covered everything I could see. I remember gripping the edge of the log so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't even call out to the others. My throat just closed up. Then it happened. The thing straightened up and I swear my heart nearly stopped. It was tall, so tall. Had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. It had these incredibly broad shoulders, like a linebacker but bigger, and its arms, God, its arms hung down so low almost to its knees. They didn't look like animal arms. They looked like human arms, just too long and covered in that hair. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds, completely upright on 2 legs. There was no mistaking it for a bear then. Bears don't stand like that. This thing stood like a man, but it wasn't a man. It couldn't be. I could see its profile, but not its face clearly. It was looking away from me, towards something moving in the underbrush. I realized there was a rabbit or something small darting through the palmettos, and this thing seemed interested in it. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting dappled light on it. I could see that the hair wasn't uniform. It was longer in some places, especially around the shoulders. There wasn't a scrap of clothing on it. Not a shirt, not pants, nothing. Just hair covering every inch. I finally managed to find my voice and called out, "Aunt Marge!" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper the first time, then louder, "Aunt Marge, look!" She called back, "What is it, honey?" The creature's head snapped in my direction. I couldn't see its eyes clearly from that distance, but I knew it was looking right at me. My whole body went cold. "There's something in the woods," I managed to say, pointing with a shaking hand. The women started talking all at once, and I heard them getting up from their spots. The creature immediately dropped back down to all fours and moved further into the woods with shocking speed. The way it moved, it wasn't clumsy at all. It was fast and deliberate. As it crashed through the underbrush, the sound was incredible. Heavy footfalls and branches snapping, even from 50 yards away. I could hear how powerful it was. Whatever it was chasing, probably that rabbit, didn't stand a chance. By the time Aunt Marge and her friends reached me, all they could see was the palmettos and branches still swaying from where it had passed through. What was it? "A gator," one of them asked, sounding concerned. I shook my head, still staring at the spot where it had disappeared. No. It was big, really big, standing up like a man but covered in hair. They exchanged looks. I know what they were thinking, that I was making it up or had seen a bear and was exaggerating. "We heard something moving through there," Aunt Marge admitted, squinting into the woods. Sounded heavy. "Let me see if I can still see it," said Helen, the youngest of the women. She was maybe in her 20s. She walked a few steps toward the tree line, shading her eyes. "There's nothing there now, honey," she said after a minute. "Probably just a big old black bear. They can stand up, you know." But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't have shoulders like that. They don't have arms that hang down like that, and they don't move through the woods the way this thing did, half human, half something else. We stayed for another hour or so, but I couldn't focus on fishing anymore. I kept staring at the woods, half expecting it to come back. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I dropped my bait twice trying to rebait my hook. Aunt Marge kept asking if I was okay, and I just nodded. What could I say? I think I just saw Bigfoot. They already thought I was being dramatic. On the ride home in Aunt Marge's station wagon, I sat in the back seat, staring out the window as we passed endless stretches of Florida scrubland. I kept wondering if there were more of those things out there, watching from the trees as we drove by. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, impossibly tall and covered in that dark hair. I kept thinking about its proportions, too big to be a man in a costume, too man-like to be any animal I knew of. The next morning I tried to tell my parents, but they had the same reaction as the women. Probably just a bear, my dad said, not looking up from his newspaper. They can look mighty strange when they stand up. I gave up trying to convince anyone after a few days, but I knew what I'd seen, and what stuck with me all these years isn't just what it looked like. It's how I felt when it looked at me. There was intelligence there, awareness. It wasn't just some animal. For weeks after, I couldn't go near the woods behind our house. Even now, all these decades later, I get uneasy in forests where the trees are too close together. My husband used to tease me about it when we'd go camping, never understanding why I always insisted on the campsites in open areas, away from the tree line. I've read about Bigfoot and skunk apes and all that over the years. Some of the descriptions match what I saw that day, but nothing's ever captured it exactly right. The height, the proportions, the way it moved. It was all so specific, so real. I'm 74 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it again. But I know what I saw that day in May of '64 wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in the swamps of Florida. The thing that haunts me most? Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still feel like I'm being watched, like whatever I saw that day is still out there, still aware that I saw it. And sometimes I wonder, what if it had decided to come closer? What if instead of moving deeper into the woods, it had moved toward us instead? I've never gone fishing near Old Bayshore Road again. Couldn't bring myself to. That place is forever changed in my mind. It's not just a fishing spot anymore. It's the place where I learned that sometimes the world is bigger and stranger than we want to believe. The women I was with that day, Aunt Marge passed away in '87, and I lost touch with the others over time. I wonder if they ever think about that day, if they ever connected the crashing sounds they heard with what I tried to tell them I'd seen. I've thought about going back there now that I'm old, just to see the place again. But something always stops me. I guess I'm afraid. Not that I'll see it again, but that I won't. That the place will just be ordinary now, and somehow that would make my memory feel less real. But I know what I saw. Standing there in the dappled sunlight, 7 feet tall at least, not quite man, not quite animal, something in between, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my garden at dusk and the shadows start to lengthen, I find myself glancing toward the trees at the edge of our property, just checking, just making sure there's nothing standing there, watching me the way I watched it all those years ago. Story 8. I've spent almost 50 years trying to make sense of what happened that night in the Everglades. It was the summer of '74, and I was working drywall jobs with my dad around Naples, Florida. We got this contract to finish the interiors of 2 houses being built out in the middle of nowhere, literally sitting on raised gravel pads surrounded by nothing but Everglades swamp as far as you could see. The developer was in some kind of hurry to get these places done, and the location was so remote that the drive back to Naples each day would have killed us on gas, not to mention the hours wasted. So we agreed to camp on site to get the job done faster. Seemed practical enough at the time. The houses were basically just shells, framed up with exterior walls, roofs and windows installed, but completely empty inside. Our job was to hang and finish all the drywall. The developer had cleared just enough space around each house for the gravel drives and a bit of yard, but beyond that was dense Everglades vegetation, palmetto bushes, cypress, and all kinds of thick brush. It was the kind of isolated spot where you felt like you were being watched all the time. That first afternoon went fine. Hot as hell, of course. We were sweating buckets inside those houses with no AC, but we made decent progress. Around dusk, I was bringing in supplies from our truck when I first noticed something odd. There was this rustling noise coming from the brush line, maybe 40 yards from where I stood. Not like a small animal. This was something substantial moving around in there. I paused, listening. The sound stopped. Then it started again, a bit further along the tree line. I called out to my dad inside the house. "You hear that?" He came out, wiping plaster dust off his hands onto his jeans. We both stood there listening as whatever it was continued to move around the perimeter of the cleared area. It would stop, then start again in a different spot. Probably a deer or wild hog, my dad said with a shrug, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought maybe it was just swamp gas or something rotting in the heat, but this was different. It reminded me of pig, but stronger, more pungent, like a mix of wet animal musk and something I can't even describe. It wasn't overwhelming, just there on the breeze occasionally when the wind shifted. We finished up for the day around 7 and decided to set up camp on the gravel drive between the two houses. It seemed like the safest spot, elevated, open with good visibility in all directions. Dad got a small fire going in one of those portable metal fire pits we'd brought along, and I started cooking some bacon and beans for dinner. The whole time, those rustling sounds continued. They'd stop for a while, then start up again in a different location, always staying just beyond the cleared area. Dad tried to play it cool, but I could tell he was keeping an eye on the tree line too. "That bacon smells good," he said, but his voice was tight. I think he was trying to keep things normal. As night fell completely, the sounds actually seemed to be getting closer, more deliberate. Not just random animal movement, but almost like something was pacing the perimeter, working up the nerve to approach. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'd grown up hunting and spending time outdoors. I knew what normal wildlife behavior sounded like, and this wasn't it. "I'm gonna grab the rifle from the car," I told my dad. We hadn't planned on bringing it, but at the last minute I'd tossed my .30-30 in the trunk. Just a precaution for camping in the middle of nowhere. I walked over to our car, which was parked about 15 yards away on the gravel drive. The night was thick with humidity, with just a quarter moon providing faint light. As I reached for the trunk, something made me freeze. I felt it before I saw anything. That sensation of being watched that triggers something primal in your brain. I turned slowly, scanning the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw them. 2 reflected points of light, like eyes catching the moonlight, about 20 feet away at the edge of the brush. They were positioned high, way higher than any deer or hog, at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground. My mouth went dry. Those eyes were looking right at me. I fumbled with my keys and got the trunk open, keeping one eye on those twin reflections the whole time. I grabbed the rifle and a flashlight, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped both. "Dad," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something out there." My dad stood up slowly by the fire. "Where?" I pointed with the flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. "Edge of the clearing, by that big palmetto clump." He squinted in that direction. "I don't see anything." "It's there," I insisted. "I'm gonna shine the light on it." I clicked on the flashlight, aiming it where I'd seen the eyes. For a split second, the beam caught something tall standing partially behind a cypress tree. The light reflected off eyes that were definitely not animal eyes I recognized. They were too big, too round, too aware. Whatever it was moved quickly behind the tree, but not before I caught a glimpse of what I can only describe as a massive frame. It was bipedal, standing upright like a person, but much, much taller. 8, maybe 9 feet tall. What really sticks with me was the hair. Not thick fur like a bear, but sparse, wispy hair that didn't fully cover the skin underneath. The skin looked dark in the brief flash of light. My dad saw it too. I know because he swore under his breath and grabbed a shovel we'd left leaning against one of the supply buckets. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The weird thing is, I didn't feel immediate danger. Whatever this thing was, it didn't charge or make aggressive moves. It just stood there, partially hidden, watching us. The smell was stronger now, that pig-like, musky odor. We stared at the tree line for what felt like forever. My arms were getting tired, holding the rifle at the ready. Then we heard movement again. Branches breaking, vegetation rustling, as whatever it was moved along the perimeter of the clearing. "Should we fire a warning shot?" I asked. Dad shook his head. "Not unless it comes closer. Don't provoke it." The rational part of my brain was trying to catalogue what I'd seen. Not a bear, definitely not a human, too tall for a hog. Nothing made sense. This was Florida in the 70s. We didn't have moose or elk. There wasn't anything in the Everglades ecosystem that matched what I'd glimpsed. For about 20 minutes, we stood there in tense silence, listening to it move around the perimeter. The eyes would occasionally appear between trees, watching us, then disappear again, always keeping its distance but clearly curious. That's when my nerve broke. "I'm going inside one of the houses," I told my dad. The structures at least had doors we could close, even if they weren't finished inside. "Yeah, good idea," he agreed. "Grab our sleeping bags." I started gathering our stuff, moving quickly but trying not to make any sudden movements. The whole time, I could feel those eyes watching me. When I turned to head toward the nearest house, I heard a distinct change in the rustling, like whatever it was had started moving more quickly, paralleling my path just within the tree line. I picked up my pace, heart pounding. Behind me, my dad called out, "Hold on, I'm coming with you!" But I was already at the door of the nearest house, fumbling with the handle. As I pulled it open and tossed our sleeping bags inside, I heard heavy footsteps, not from my dad, but from somewhere between me and the campfire. I spun around and saw my dad frozen halfway between the fire and the house. His eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, rifle ready. There it was, partially emerged from the brush about 30 feet from the house. In the faint glow of our campfire, I could make out more details now. It was enormous, with long arms hanging below its knees. The face was hard to see clearly, but it had a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. The sparse hair covered its body unevenly, and in the firelight, the exposed skin looked almost grayish-brown. It wasn't acting aggressive. It just stood there, watching us with what seemed like curiosity. Then it turned its attention to our campfire, specifically to the pan of bacon we'd left sitting there. My dad backed slowly toward me in the house. "Inside now," he whispered. We retreated into the house and closed the door, moving to a window where we could see the campfire. What happened next still gives me chills when I think about it. The creature approached our campfire slowly, cautiously. It moved like a person, but with an odd gait, knees slightly bent, arms swinging. When it reached the fire, it squatted down, those long arms reaching for the pan with our leftover bacon. "Is it taking our food?" my dad whispered. That's exactly what it was doing. It picked up the pan, sniffed it, then used its fingers to take out the bacon strips. It ate them, making soft grunting noises that we could hear even from inside the house. We watched, completely stunned, as this enormous creature finished off our bacon, then carefully set the pan back down. It looked toward the house, directly at the window where we were watching, and just stared for several long moments. I raised the rifle, not to shoot, but ready if needed. The creature seemed to understand the gesture. It backed away from the fire slowly, never turning its back to us, until it reached the edge of the clearing. Then it simply melted back into the vegetation. We spent a sleepless night in that half-finished house, taking turns keeping watch. Every hour or so, we'd hear rustling from different points around the clearing, but the creature never fully emerged again. When dawn finally broke, I went outside to check around. My dad thought I was crazy, but I had to know if there was any evidence. I searched the perimeter of the clearing, looking for tracks or hair. Anything. The problem was, the entire area around the houses was covered in that gravel. The only place that might have shown tracks was the softer ground at the very edge of the brush line. But even there, I didn't find any clear prints, just broken vegetation and disturbed areas where something large had obviously moved through. We packed up and left that morning, told the developer we couldn't finish the job, made up some excuse about another contract coming up. I don't think my dad and I even discussed what we'd seen. Not really. We just silently agreed to get the hell out of there and not go back. About 3 weeks later, I was reading the Naples Daily News when I came across a small article buried on page 7. It mentioned several reports from workers and residents about Sasquatch sightings in the Everglades, specifically in the area we'd been working. The article treated it like a joke, like these people were just seeing things or making stuff up for attention. I showed it to my dad. He read it, folded the paper and just said, "Well, at least it liked our bacon." To this day, I have no explanation for what we encountered out there. I've thought about going back to that spot many times over the years, but something always stops me. I guess some things are better left alone. All I know is that whatever was watching us from the brush that night wasn't something that's supposed to exist in Florida, or anywhere else for that matter. Story 9. I'm still struggling to come to terms with what happened to me over 15 years ago. I've tried to rationalize it, but no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind, I can't find an explanation that makes sense. It was early October 2008. I'd taken a week off work to do some solo hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Fall foliage season was in full swing, but I deliberately chose a less popular trail to avoid crowds. I wanted solitude, time to clear my head after a brutal quarter at work. The day started perfectly. Crisp autumn air, not too cold, just enough bite to feel invigorating. The colors were unbelievable. Reds, oranges, yellows against the evergreens. I'd started out around 9 in the morning, packed light but prepared. Trail mix, water, extra layers, compass, map. The usual. I'd planned a 6-hour loop that would bring me back to my car well before sunset. Around 4 in the afternoon, I realized I'd somehow gotten off the main trail. I'm usually pretty good with navigation, so this rattled me a bit. The marked trail had gradually become less distinct until I found myself standing in a patch of woods with no clear path forward. The sun was already dropping behind the mountains and the temperature was falling fast. I checked my map and compass, trying to orient myself. I figured if I headed east, I'd eventually hit the main trail again, or at least reach the road. So I picked my way carefully through the underbrush, constantly checking my compass. That's when I first noticed the sound. Footsteps, heavy ones, not like a deer or smaller animal. Something big was moving through the forest behind me. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. When I stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. "Hello?" I called out. "Anybody there?" Nothing, just the wind in the trees and distant bird calls. I kept moving faster now. The sun was fading quickly, and the forest was filling with shadows. The footsteps started again, matching my pace but staying behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I told myself it was just an echo, maybe the sound of my own movements bouncing off the dense trees, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The light was getting dimmer by the minute. That weird twilight time in the forest when everything starts to look different, when familiar shapes transform into something else. I pulled out my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I could still see enough, and I didn't want to drain the batteries. That's when I saw it for the first time, just a glimpse through the trees about 30 yards back. Something tall and dark moving between the trunks. Not moving like a person hikes, more fluid, yet powerful. I froze, squinting to see better. It was upright, massive. The outline was too broad to be human. One arm hung lower than the other, and I could see what looked like long hair catching the last bits of fading light. The head was large with a distinctive slope to it, and the shoulders were unnaturally wide. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was a bear, had to be a bear. But bears don't walk upright for extended periods, and this thing was following me, tracking me. Then the smell hit me. God, that smell, like wet fur mixed with something rotting and the rich, damp scent of soil after rain. It was powerful enough to make my eyes water, and it hadn't been there a moment before. I started walking faster, no longer worried about making noise. The darkness was settling in now, and I had to use my flashlight to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. Every few seconds I'd glance back, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, but I never caught more than a shadow moving behind trees. The creature kept pace with me, never losing track despite the growing darkness. It seemed to know the terrain better than I did, moving parallel to me at times, then behind me again. I heard branches snapping under its weight. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into my bones. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a moose. Nothing I could identify. It was primeval, something from a time before humans walked these woods. The footsteps suddenly changed rhythm. They were coming faster. It was rushing toward me. Pure panic took over. I started running, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. My breathing was ragged, and tears were streaming down my face from fear and the cold air. I broke through into a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It stood at the edge of the clearing, partially illuminated by my flashlight. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its chest was massive, barrel-shaped, with long arms that hung down past its knees. Dark brown matted hair covered its entire body, but its eyes, Jesus, its eyes, deep set under a prominent brow ridge, they caught my flashlight beam and reflected back with an intense focus. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. There was something else there, awareness, intelligence. Those eyes locked directly on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We just stared at each other across that clearing for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. It didn't charge at me like I expected. Instead, it began to circle the clearing slowly, never breaking eye contact. It moved with a strange grace for something so massive, its feet making surprisingly little noise now that I could see it. I don't know what broke the spell. Maybe a distant sound, maybe some primal survival instinct, but suddenly I could move again. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran in what I hoped was the direction of the trail. Behind me, I could hear it moving again, following but not running, just maintaining that same steady pace, tracking me. I stumbled through the darkening forest, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I ran, illuminating trees and rocks for split seconds before moving on. By some miracle, I found the main trail again. It was wider, more defined, and I nearly collapsed with relief. But the creature was still behind me. I could hear it moving through the trees parallel to the trail, branches snapping, occasional grunts, and that wet, heavy breathing. It followed me for what must have been 2 more miles. Never showing itself fully again, but making its presence known through sounds and glimpses of movement just beyond my flashlight's reach. It seemed to be pacing me, keeping me in sight, but maintaining distance. When I finally Finally saw the glint of my car in the parking lot. I almost cried. I ran the last 100 yards, fumbling with my keys, constantly looking back toward the tree line. The sounds had stopped, but I could feel it watching me from the darkness. I knew it was there, just beyond where I could see. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a good 10 minutes, the engine running and headlights on, illuminating the edge of the forest. Nothing emerged. Eventually, I put the car in gear and drove away, checking my rear-view mirror obsessively until I reached the main road. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes, about being followed through endless dark woods. The few people I told, close friends, my brother, they all had the same response, probably just a bear. One suggested I'd seen a moose and panicked in the growing darkness, but I know what I saw. I know what followed me was something far larger and more intelligent than any known animal in those mountains. The way it moved, the way it watched me, the way it tracked me without ever losing me despite the darkness. That wasn't normal animal behavior. I've researched extensively since then, read accounts of similar encounters, looked into the history of the White Mountains area, even reached out anonymously to local rangers to ask about unusual sightings. I've found enough to know I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this, but not enough to explain what these creatures are or why they're there. I went back to hiking eventually, but never alone, and never in that particular area again. I still love the mountains, but something changed in me that day. I understand now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still see those eyes watching me from the darkness. And I wonder if somewhere in the White Mountains, that creature remembers me too. Story 10. It has been over 20 years since that morning, but I still get chills thinking about it. Every detail is burned into my brain like it happened yesterday. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, but I know what I saw, and so did our dog. I grew up in a remote part of Colorado, tucked away in San Miguel Canyon behind Fisher's Peak. Our house sat on a small, cleared area with the canyon stretching out behind it, all pine trees, brush, and uneven terrain that dropped away into shadows. We didn't have neighbors for miles, just us, the wildlife, and apparently something else. It was early spring, still chilly in the mornings. I was 13 at the time, and normally I wouldn't be up at 6 in the morning unless I had to be, especially on a Saturday. But that morning, something woke me up. Scout's barking. Scout was our German Shepherd mix, about 5 years old then. He was a good dog, protective, but not usually one to make a fuss without reason. He'd bark at deer sometimes, or the occasional coyote that wandered too close to the property. But this wasn't his normal, "Hey, there's something out there," bark. This was different, frantic, aggressive, like he was genuinely alarmed. I stumbled out of my bedroom, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and found Scout at the kitchen window that faced the canyon. He was standing with his front paws up on the counter, something he knew he wasn't supposed to do, his entire body rigid. His hackles were raised all the way down his back, and he was making this low growling sound between sharp, loud barks. "Scout, what is it? Get down," I mumbled, still half asleep, but Scout didn't budge. He didn't even acknowledge me, which was weird. His eyes were locked on something outside, his attention so focused that it was like I wasn't even there. That's when I felt the first chill. Something was wrong. I moved to the window, standing beside Scout, and peered out into the early morning light. The sun wasn't fully up yet, casting long shadows across the canyon. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the trees, the brush, the uneven ground sloping away from our property. Then I saw movement. About 70 yards away, where the tree line started to thicken, something was moving through the brush. Something big. My first thought was that it might be an elk or a bear. We had both in the area, but as I focused on the movement, I realized whatever it was wasn't moving on four legs. It was upright. Walking, I pressed closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window. Scout's barking intensified, but it seemed distant now as all my attention zeroed in on the figure moving through the trees. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. Maybe 7 feet, possibly more, and it was covered in dark, almost black hair. Not clothes. Hair. It moved with these long strides, navigating the uneven ground of the canyon in a way that struck me as odd. It had this side-to-side motion like it was shifting its weight to adjust for the terrain's small dips and rises. I remember thinking it moved too smoothly for how rough the ground was, like it knew exactly where to place its feet without looking down. The realization hit me like a bucket of cold water. I was watching something that wasn't human walk through our canyon. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Scout's barking seemed to echo my own panic. I needed someone else to see this, to confirm I wasn't imagining things. "Mom, Dad!" I shouted, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Come quick, there's something out there." I was afraid to look away, afraid it would disappear if I didn't keep my eyes on it, but I needed my parents to see it too. "Mom, Dad!" I yelled again, louder this time. I heard my dad first, his heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. "What's going on?" His voice was thick with sleep. "Why is Scout barking like that?" "There's something in the canyon," I said, pointing frantically toward the window. "Look, it's right there, walking through the trees." My mum appeared behind him, pulling a robe around herself. "What is it? A bear?" "No, it's walking on 2 legs. It's huge and covered in hair. Look, right there." I pointed again, desperately trying to direct their gaze to where I could still see the figure moving. But in the seconds it had taken me to call for my parents, the creature had moved deeper into the canyon. The angle from the window had changed, and it was partially obscured by trees now. My dad moved to the window, squinting out into the morning light. "Where? I don't see anything." "It's there, in the trees." I pressed my finger against the glass, leaving a smudge. "It's moving down into the canyon." Scout was still going crazy, barking and growling, his eyes fixed on the exact spot where I was pointing. That had to count for something, right? He saw it too. My dad put his hand on Scout's head, trying to calm him. "Easy, boy. What's got you so worked up?" "Dad, seriously, it's right there." I was starting to get frustrated. How could they not see it? It was so obvious to me. Then I caught one last glimpse of it. There was a small clearing between a cluster of pine trees, maybe 50 yards away now, and at a different angle than when I'd first spotted it. For just a second, the figure moved through that clearing, and I saw its full height against the backdrop of trees. It was massive, broad-shouldered and covered completely in dark hair. It moved with purpose, like it had somewhere to be, swinging its long arms slightly as it walked. And then it was gone, disappeared into the deeper shadows of the canyon. "There, did you see it?" I looked at my parents, desperate for confirmation. My mom looked concerned, but not in the way I wanted. "Honey, I didn't see anything but trees." "But Scout sees it." I pointed at our dog, who was still fixated on the canyon, though his barking had quieted to a low, continuous growl. His body was still tense, his hackles still raised. My dad frowned, looking between me and Scout. "Something definitely has him worked up." "It was there," I insisted, my voice cracking. "I swear it was there. It was big and walking on 2 legs and covered in dark hair. It wasn't human, Dad." My parents exchanged that look, the one parents give each other when they're not sure what to do with their kids' imagination. But I could tell they were unsettled by Scout's behavior. He wasn't the type of dog to get this agitated over nothing. "Maybe it was a bear standing up," my mom suggested gently. "They do that sometimes." I shook my head firmly. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. This thing was moving across the ground like Like it knew the terrain, like it belonged there. My dad put his arm around my shoulders. Well, whatever it was, it's gone now, and we're safe inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as safe as he thought, that whatever I had seen out there was more aware of us than we were of it. Scout stayed at that window for nearly an hour, his body gradually relaxing but his eyes never leaving the canyon. Eventually, he jumped down and went to lie by the door, still watchful, still alert. My parents tried to brush it off. They made breakfast, talked about their plans for the day, acted like nothing unusual had happened. But I caught them glancing out the window more often than normal, and my dad checked to make sure all the doors were locked before we sat down to eat, something he never did in the daytime. I couldn't eat. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a person. No human is that tall or moves quite like that. It wasn't a bear. The way it walked was too smooth, too purposeful. It was something else entirely. Later that day, I went outside with my dad to check around the property. I was scared, but also curious. I wanted evidence, something to prove what I'd seen was real. "Can we go down into the canyon?" I asked. My dad hesitated. "Not today. The ground's still wet from yesterday's rain. Too slippery." But I knew that wasn't the real reason. He was spooked too, even if he wouldn't admit it. We looked for tracks around our property line, but the ground was too hard and rocky to show anything clear. Scout stayed unusually close to us the whole time, his ears perked and alert, his eyes scanning the tree line constantly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the figure, its fluid movement through the rough terrain, the way it had disappeared so completely into the canyon shadows. I lay awake listening to every creak and rustle outside my window, wondering if it was still out there, watching our house. Scout slept in my room that night, something he rarely did. He positioned himself between my bed and the window, as if standing guard. I felt safer with him there, but I still didn't sleep well. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with what I'd seen. I checked books out from the library about local wildlife, convinced myself it couldn't have been any known animal. I started reading about Bigfoot sightings, about people who claimed to have seen similar creatures in remote areas. The descriptions matched what I had seen: the height, the dark hair, the distinctive way of moving. I started to believe that's what had walked through our canyon that morning. A Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it. My parents grew concerned about my fixation. They suggested maybe I'd seen a particularly tall hiker, or maybe the morning light had played tricks on my eyes. They wanted me to let it go, to stop talking about it, especially when I started having nightmares. But how do you forget something like that? How do you convince yourself you didn't see what you know you saw? We lived in that house for 5 more years before moving closer to town for my dad's job. During that time, I never saw the creature again. Though there were moments, sudden silences in the forest, unexpected movements caught in my peripheral vision that made me wonder if it was still around, just staying better hidden. Scout never forgot either. Until the day we moved, he remained unusually vigilant about the canyon, especially in the early mornings. Sometimes he'd freeze, staring out toward the trees, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I always knew he was looking for the same thing I was. It's been over 20 years now. I've told this story to a few people over the years, usually met with skepticism or polite nods. Most people think I imagined it or exaggerated a normal wildlife sighting. My parents to this day gently suggest it was probably just a bear, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm camping or hiking in remote areas, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for that distinctive movement, that tall, hair-covered figure striding confidently through rough terrain. I've never seen it again, but I know it's out there, and I know it wasn't human. Scout knew it too. Story 11. I still get chills when I drive past East Fork State Park at night. What happened in the summer of 2004 has basically ruined my ability to enjoy camping or even just sitting in my car after dark. I've tried talking to people about it over the years, but most just think I'm making stuff up, or that I was tired and seeing things. But I know what I saw that night. It was early August, one of those sticky Ohio summer nights where even at 2 in the morning it's still uncomfortably warm. I was sitting in my car across from the park on Hollington Road. My little spot was about a quarter mile from any neighbors, which is why I liked parking there to talk on the phone late at night. I didn't have to worry about waking anyone up. That night, I was on the phone with my girlfriend. We'd been talking for almost an hour about some stupid fight we'd had earlier. The windows were rolled down because my car's AC was broken, and I remember the crickets were so loud I had to turn up the volume on my phone. Every now and then, headlights would pass on the main road, but they were getting fewer as it got later. I was leaning back in my seat, half paying attention to what she was saying about her mum's new boyfriend, when I noticed something moving down the road. At first, I thought it was just somebody walking their dog, even though it seemed like a weird time for that, but there was something off about the way it was moving. "Hold on a sec," I told my girlfriend, sitting up straighter and squinting through the windshield. The thing was walking along the edge of the road about 50 yards away, and its shape seemed wrong. It was dark out, but there was a streetlight ahead, one of those old yellow ones that the county put in at intersections. When it stepped under the streetlight, I felt my whole body go cold despite the heat. I could see it clearly for just a few seconds, and I'll never forget what I saw. This wasn't a person walking a dog. This wasn't a person at all. The figure was huge, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, maybe 7 feet, possibly even taller. But it wasn't just the height that made my heart start hammering. It was its proportions. Its arms were unnaturally long, swinging at its sides as it walked. They hung down almost to its knees, and they looked powerful, not skinny like you'd expect, with something that tall. The body was massive, big and wide, especially across the shoulders and chest, and it was covered in hair, not like a person in a fur coat, but actual hair growing all over its body. Under the yellow streetlight, I could make out the color, a deep reddish brown, like dark rust or auburn. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered everything I could see. "Hello? Are you still there?" My girlfriend's voice seemed miles away. "Yeah," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the thing. "There's something... I don't know what it is, but there's something outside." It was walking upright on 2 legs, completely vertical like a human, but its stride was different, longer, more deliberate. Each step covered more ground than seemed possible. It crossed the street in just a few strides, moving from the edge of the road toward my side. "What do you mean, something? Like an animal?" she asked. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. The thing was now crossing what was technically my front yard, though it was just an open grassy area between my driveway and my neighbor's property. It moved with purpose, not rushing but not dawdling either. I think I'm seeing a Bigfoot," I finally managed to say. Even as the words came out, I felt stupid saying them, but I couldn't think of anything else that matched what I was seeing. She laughed, thinking I was joking. "Right, and I'm talking to Dracula." But I wasn't joking. The creature continued across my yard, then into my neighbor's property, before disappearing into the tree line that marked the beginning of the dense woods that ran behind all the properties on our side of the road. Just before it entered the woods, I saw it turn its head, scanning the area. That movement was so deliberate, so intelligent looking. It wasn't the random head movement of a deer or bear. It was looking around, checking its surroundings. I couldn't make out its face clearly at that distance, but I could see the silhouette of its head against the night sky. It had a sort of cone-shaped head, not flat like a human's, more like it sloped up and back. "I'm serious," I hissed into the phone, ducking down in my seat even though I was pretty sure it hadn't seen me. "There's something walking through my yard. It's huge, walking on 2 legs and covered in reddish hair." "Are you drunk?" she asked, her tone changing from amused. to concerned. No. I swear to God, I'm stone cold sober. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. It just went into the woods. After it disappeared into the trees, I sat frozen in my car for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. My girlfriend kept telling me to go inside, lock the doors and call the police, but I was too scared to get out of the car. What if it was still out there watching? What if there were more of them? The way it moved wasn't like any normal animal I'd ever seen. Bears can stand upright, sure, but they don't walk that way for any distance. This thing was moving naturally on two legs, with those big shoulders rolling slightly as it walked, and the arms, those long arms that swung with each stride. That's what keeps coming back to me in nightmares. I finally got the courage to drive home around 3 in the morning. My house was only about 200 yards down the road, but I still locked all the doors and windows as soon as I got inside. I kept peering out the windows, expecting to see that figure emerging from the trees again. Around 4 a.m., I heard vehicles outside. Looking through my blinds, I saw 2 sheriff's cruisers moving slowly down the road, officers shining spotlights into the yards and the edge of the woods. Clearly, someone else had seen something too. I threw on some shoes and went outside, flagging down one of the cruisers. The officer rolled down his window, looking tired and a bit annoyed. "You see something suspicious tonight, sir?" he asked, not bothering to get out of the car. I told him what I'd seen, the tall figure, the reddish hair, the way it walked upright. I tried to be as specific as possible, describing how its arms swung and how it had looked around before entering the woods. The officer's expression didn't change much, but he wrote some notes down. "We've had a couple reports of unusual activity in the area tonight. Probably just a bear, though. They can look pretty strange when they stand up." "This wasn't a bear," I insisted. "Bears don't walk like that for that long. And its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, and its shoulders were too wide." He just nodded, clearly humoring me. "Well, we're taking a look around. If you see anything else, give us a call, and maybe stay inside for the rest of the night, just to be safe." That was it. They drove off, continuing their search, and I never heard anything about it again. No follow-up, no report in the local paper, nothing. When I called the sheriff's office a few days later, the dispatcher said they hadn't found anything unusual that night. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been someone in a costume? Maybe, but the movements were too natural, too fluid. There was no stiffness like you'd see with someone wearing a suit. And why would someone be wandering around in a Bigfoot costume at 2 in the morning in rural Ohio? Could it have been a bear with mange, or some other condition that made it look strange? I've watched countless videos of bears walking upright, and none of them move the way this thing moved. Bears have a distinctive waddle when they're on 2 legs. This creature had a stride. What about a person with some kind of medical condition? But that doesn't explain the all-over hair, the sheer size, or those proportions. No human has arms that long or shoulders that wide. The more I've thought about it over the years, the more convinced I've become that what I saw was something science hasn't officially recognized. Call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. There was something in Claremont County that night that wasn't human and wasn't any known animal. My girlfriend at the time eventually broke up with me, partly because I wouldn't stop talking about what I'd seen. She thought I was either lying for attention or that I'd had some kind of hallucination. But I know what I saw. I've gone back to that spot in the daytime a few times over the years, looking for any sign. Broken branches, unusual tracks, hair caught on tree bark. I've never found anything conclusive, but I've talked to a few locals who have their own stories. A hunter who found a deer carcass placed high up in a tree. A woman whose horses get spooked at night for no apparent reason. A teenager who swears he heard something mimicking human voices in the woods. None of them have seen what I saw, though. That combination of features, the reddish hair catching the light, The impossibly long arms, the big shoulders, the deliberate, intelligent head movement. It's burned into my memory. I can close my eyes right now and see it perfectly, stepping under that streetlight, its silhouette unmistakable against the darkness. It's been almost 20 years, and I still get that cold feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw that night, and it wasn't anything that should exist according to science textbooks. Sometimes, when I drive past that spot, especially at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again, and honestly, I don't know if I'm more afraid of seeing it again or of never seeing it again, of living the rest of my life wondering what the hell was walking through my yard that summer night in 2004. Story 12. I still don't sleep well. It's been almost 2 years since it happened, but I still wake up in cold sweats, thinking I can smell that coppery stench of blood mixed with damp earth. Some nights, I think I hear something scratching at my window, but I'm afraid to look. I know what I saw that day, even if the department wants to pretend otherwise. I was working patrol in Elmore County when the call came through. It was around 2 in the afternoon, sunny day, nothing special about it. Dispatch said there was a possible assault at the Baker property, old ranch about 20 miles outside town. The housekeeper had called, hysterical, saying something about the homeowner being thrown down a well. Dispatch couldn't make much sense of it. They thought maybe it was a language barrier issue or that the housekeeper was in shock. I was the closest unit, so I took the call. The Baker property was off the main road, down a long gravel driveway lined with pine trees. The place was well maintained, big ranch house, couple of outbuildings, a barn that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I parked by the front steps and called in my arrival. I knocked on the door and announced myself. Sheriff's Department. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. I could hear movement inside, but nobody came to the door. I tried the handle. It was unlocked, so I pushed it open slowly, hand on my whole spin. Sheriff's Department. Anyone home? I heard a small whimper from somewhere upstairs. I stepped inside, scanning the entryway. Nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of a struggle. The house was cool and dim compared to the bright afternoon outside. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Wilson with the Sheriff's Department. Are you all right?" I called out, moving toward the staircase. Another whimper, then I saw her, the housekeeper, at the top of the stairs. She was crouched down, peeking through the banister railings like a frightened child. Her eyes were wide, face pale. She was clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you come down so we can talk?" She shook her head frantically. No, senor, it is still out there." Her accent was thick, her voice trembling. "What's out there, ma'am? Who attacked Mr. Baker?" She just kept shaking her head, mumbling something in Spanish that I couldn't understand. "Ma'am, I need to check on Mr. Baker. You said he fell down a well." "Not fell," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It throw him, the monster, El Diablo." She crossed herself. I tried to keep my voice calm and even. "A person attacked Mr. Baker." "No person, big muy grande." She stretched her hand high above her head. "Like bear, but not bear. Stand like man." Great, I thought. Either the poor woman was having some kind of breakdown or someone in a costume had attacked the homeowner. Either way, I needed to find Baker. "I'm going to check outside, ma'am. Is there anyone else on the property I should know about?" She shook her head. "Just me and Senor Baker today. Gardeners come tomorrow." "Okay, I need you to stay inside and lock the door behind me. Can you do that?" She nodded but made no move to come downstairs. I realized she wasn't going to, so I headed back to the front door. "Where is the well located, ma'am?" She pointed toward the back of the house. "Behind house, near trees." "Thank you. Remember, lock this door." I stepped outside and radioed in an update to dispatch. I explained that I had an alleged assault victim possibly injured in a well on the property and that I was going to check it out. I requested backup and medical, just in case. Dispatch acknowledged and said units were on the way, ETA 15 minutes. I made my way around the house, scanning the area as I went. The property was well kept. Manicured lawn, flower beds along the house, a stone path leading to the back. As I rounded the corner, I saw the well. It was about 100 yards from the house, near the tree line where the woods began. The well was old, stone construction, probably original to the property. It had a wooden roof over it and a crank mechanism for the bucket. I approached cautiously, scanning the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of a struggle. No footprints that I could see in the grass. The area was quiet. Too quiet now that I think about it. No birds, no insects buzzing, just the sound of my boots on the grass and my own breathing. When I reached the well, I noticed the wooden cover had been thrown aside. The crank mechanism was intact, but the rope was broken. I leaned over the edge carefully. "Mr. Baker," I called down. "Can you hear me? This is Deputy Wilson with the Sheriff's Department." I listened. Nothing. I took out my flashlight and shined it down the well, but couldn't see much. It was too deep, the bottom lost in darkness. The beam only illuminated about 15 feet of mossy stone walls before disappearing into blackness. "Mr. Baker," I called again. "Louder this time. If you can hear me, make a noise." I thought I heard something then. A faint groan, maybe. Or it could have been the wind. I couldn't be sure. I radioed in again, updating dispatch that I believed we had an injured person in the well, and to have fire and rescue bring extraction equipment. Then I leaned over again, trying to get a better look. That's when I noticed it. A smear of what looked like blood on the inside of the well, just below the lip. Fresh, still wet, and something else. Deep scratches in the stone, like something had clawed its way up. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step back from the well, unsnapping my holster. That's when I heard it, a faint scuffling sound from inside the well. I leaned forward again, shining my light down. The beam caught movement. Something was climbing up the well shaft, fast. Much too fast to be human. I barely had time to jump back before it exploded out of the opening. A massive grey-furred shape that sailed over my head and landed with a heavy thud on the ground behind me. I fell backwards, scrambling for my weapon. Time seemed to slow down as I got my first real look at it. It stood on two legs, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was covered in thick grey fur with patches of white, like an old man's beard. But it wasn't the size that froze my blood. It was the face. God, that face. Wrinkled, leathery skin stretched over a skull that was almost human, but wrong somehow. The proportions all off. Its eyes were deep-set, intelligent, burning with a cold hatred, and its mouth, its lips and teeth were smeared with fresh blood, strings of something hung from its jaws. I realized with horror that it was flesh, human flesh. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two. I had my gun halfway out of my holster when it moved. It didn't charge at me like I expected. Instead, it turned and bounded toward the tree line, moving with incredible speed despite its size. 4 or 5 massive strides, and it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I finally got my weapon drawn and pointed it at the trees, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep aim. My radio squawked, making me jump. Unit 4. Status update? I couldn't speak for a moment. My throat had closed up. I finally managed to key my mic. Dispatch. I need immediate backup at my location. All available units. Possible. I didn't know how to describe what I'd just seen. Possible dangerous animal on the loose. And expedite that ambulance. Copy that. Unit 4. Units are en route. ETA 10 minutes. Can you describe the animal? I hesitated. Large, bipedal creature. Grey fur. Extremely dangerous. I believe it has attacked and seriously injured the homeowner. There was a pause on the other end. Unit 4. Did you say bipedal? Affirmative. Dispatch. Just send everything you've got. I kept my weapon trained on the tree line as I cautiously approached the well again. I needed to check on Baker. I couldn't just leave him down there. "Mr. Baker!" I called down. "Help is on the way. Can you hear me?" This time I definitely heard a moan. He was alive. "Hang on, sir. Emergency services are coming. Just hold on." I stayed by the well, dividing my attention between the opening and the tree line, terrified that thing would come back. The minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. I've never been so relieved to hear that sound in my life. 2 patrol cars arrived first, then an ambulance, then the fire truck with rescue equipment. I briefed the other deputies quickly, trying to stick to the facts without sounding crazy. I told them there was an injured man in the well and a dangerous animal, possibly a bear in the woods. I didn't mention that it walked on 2 legs or had a face like an old man. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. The fire department set up their equipment to extract Baker from the well. One of the firefighters was lowered down on a harness. When they brought Baker up, I almost threw up. He was alive, but barely. Large chunks of flesh had been torn from his legs and side. It looked like something had been feeding on him. The paramedics rushed to stabilize him. He was conscious but in shock, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. They loaded him into the ambulance and took off, sirens blaring. Meanwhile, the other deputies had formed a perimeter around the property. Animal control showed up too, along with some guys from Fish and Wildlife. They all looked skeptical when I described what I'd seen. "Probably a bear," the Fish and Wildlife officer said. "They can stand on their hind legs, look pretty human from a distance when they do that." You were in shock seeing it go after a man like that. I didn't argue. What was the point? I knew what I saw. The housekeeper finally came out of the house, flanked by 2 deputies. She was still trembling, clutching her rosary. When they tried to lead her to a patrol car, she became hysterical, pointing at the woods and screaming something in Spanish. They had to practically carry her to the car. She wouldn't go anywhere without officers surrounding her. After that, things get fuzzy. More people showed up, guys in unmarked vehicles, some in suits, some in tactical gear without agency identification. One of them, an older man with a grey beard, took me aside. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. Not asked, said, like an order. So I told him. Everything. The way it moved, the blood on its face, the intelligence in its eyes. He didn't look surprised or skeptical. He just nodded and wrote things down in a small notebook. "You're being reassigned," he said when I finished. "Effective immediately." "What?" "You can't do that. I'm County Sheriff's Department. You don't have jurisdiction." "It's already done," he cut me off. "You'll report to the station tomorrow for reassignment. In the meantime, you're not to discuss this incident with anyone. Not your colleagues, not your family, not even your dog." "Understood." I didn't understand, not really, but I nodded anyway. They took over the scene after that. I was sent back to the station to write up my report, but when I got there, my sergeant told me to go home. Said I'd been through a traumatic experience and needed rest. When I came in the next day, I was assigned to desk duty. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to a different county altogether. I never heard what happened to Baker or the housekeeper. I tried looking into it a few times, but hit brick walls everywhere I turned. The official report said Baker had fallen down the well and been attacked by a bear. Case closed. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night and my route takes me past wooded areas, I catch myself scanning the tree line. Because I know it's still out there. And I know now why the housekeeper took so long to come downstairs that day. She was afraid it had followed her into the house. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. Every time I start typing, I delete it all and walk away. But I need to get this off my chest. What happened to me in the Mount Adams wilderness in July of 2012 has haunted me ever since. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. I've always been an avid hiker and backpacker, usually preferring to go solo. There's something about being alone in nature that recharges me in a way nothing else can, or at least there was. I don't go anymore, not since what happened. It was mid-July, perfect weather for backpacking in the Pacific Northwest. I had 5 days off work and decided to head to the Mount Adams Wilderness in Washington. I'd hiked there before, but always on the more popular trails. This time, I wanted to go deeper, to find that perfect solitude that draws so many of us into the backcountry. I parked at a small trailhead early in the morning, double-checked my gear, and headed out. My plan was to hike about 8 miles in, well away from the day hikers and weekend warriors, and set up a base camp where I could explore from for a few days. By mid-afternoon, I found what seemed like the perfect spot, a small clearing beside a creek with a natural stone fire ring that previous hikers had built. Someone had even gathered a small pile of firewood. The area was beautiful, tall pines surrounding the clearing, the gentle sound of the creek, and Mount Adams visible through breaks in the trees. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area. That first night was peaceful, probably the last peaceful night I'll ever spend in the wilderness. I had a small fire, ate my dehydrated dinner, and fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. The second day, I hiked around, taking photos and enjoying the solitude. I saw some deer, lots of birds, even spotted what I think was a marten. I returned to camp in the late afternoon, gathered more firewood, and started preparing dinner. That's when I first noticed something felt off. The forest got quiet, and I don't mean just quiet. I mean that unnatural stillness where you suddenly realize even the insects have stopped making noise. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows what I'm talking about. It's that silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I paused what I was doing and listened. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels chattering. Even the creek seemed to be running quieter somehow. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was probably just a predator passing through. Maybe a bear or a cougar that had spooked the wildlife into silence. As the sun set, I built up my fire, trying to focus on normal camp tasks instead of the growing sense of unease. The shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. It was almost fully dark when I heard it, the sound of a tree groaning. Not the normal creaking that trees sometimes make in the wind, but a deep, straining groan, like something was putting immense pressure on it. Then came a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing, followed by a thud that I swear I felt through the ground. I jumped to my feet, grabbing my flashlight but not turning it on yet. My eyes had adjusted to the firelight, and I didn't want to ruin my night vision. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. Between 2 massive pines at the edge of my clearing, a figure stepped forward. At first, my brain tried to process it as a bear standing on its hind legs, but that explanation fell apart immediately. This thing was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they practically blocked out the forest behind it. Its body was covered in shaggy, dark brown hair. In the firelight, I could see steam rising from it, like its body heat was meeting the cool night air. But it was the proportions that were all wrong. Arms hanging down past where a person's knees would be, ending in massive hands with fingers that I could see curling and uncurling slowly. For a moment, it just stood there, and I stood frozen across the campfire from it. Then it took another step forward, and the firelight caught its face. God, that face. I'll never forget it as long as I live. A heavy brow jutted out over dark eyes that were fixed directly on me. It had a flat, wide nose and a mouth set in what looked like a grimace. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal intelligence, but something else. something that recognized me for what I was and was deciding what to do about me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think about running. We just stared at each other across my little campfire for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any warning, it turned away from me toward a cluster of young trees at the edge of the clearing. What happened next still doesn't seem possible, even though I watched it with my own eyes. The creature reached out and gripped one of the saplings, a tree thicker than my leg, and just ripped it from the ground. There's no other way to describe it. The roots tore free from the earth with a sound like fabric ripping. The ground actually shook. It lifted the entire tree, roots and all, overhead like it weighed nothing. Then it threw it. Just hurled this 20-foot sapling through the air like it was tossing aside a broomstick. The tree crashed into the forest with a tremendous noise, branches snapping and cracking. Before I could process what I'd just seen, it moved to another tree, slightly larger than the first. Same thing, grabbed it, tore it free from the earth and flung it away. Then another and another, each one bigger than the last. I was watching a demonstration of raw, terrifying strength. It was methodical, almost like it was showing me what it could do. With each tree it uprooted, it would pause and look back at me, those dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Finally, I managed to unfreeze. My hand was still clutching my flashlight, and without thinking, I raised it and switched it on, shining the beam directly into the creature's face. It squinted in the sudden light, and its lips curled back, revealing large, square teeth. Not fangs like a predator, but square, flat teeth. More like a human's, only larger. It made a low, rumbling sound deep in its chest that I felt more than heard. Then it deliberately turned away, walked to an even larger tree, this one probably 6 inches in diameter, and tore it from the ground with a single, violent motion. Dirt and rocks showered down as the roots ripped free. It held the tree overhead for a moment, looking directly at me before throwing it so hard it practically exploded against a larger pine. The message couldn't have been clearer. This is what I could do to you if I wanted. I don't know how long this went on. Time seemed to stop. It might have been 10 minutes or an hour of watching this thing demolish trees around the perimeter of my camp. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse, but I remained standing, frozen in place, clutching my useless flashlight. Finally, after uprooting what must have been the 10th or 11th tree, the creature stopped. It stood at the edge of my clearing, silhouetted against the darkness, its massive chest heaving. Then it threw back its head and let out a sound I'll never forget. A long, furious yell that started low and rose in pitch until it echoed off the mountains. It wasn't a howl like a wolf or a roar like a bear. It was something else entirely, something that felt almost human, but not quite. When the echo of that terrible sound finally faded, the creature turned and walked into the darkness of the forest. I could hear branches breaking under its weight as it moved away, the sound growing fainter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, my flashlight still pointed at the spot where it had disappeared. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I sat heavily on the ground next to my fire, which had burned low while I was distracted by whatever I had just witnessed. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept the fire blazing as high as I could get it, feeding it with shaking hands whenever it started to die down. I had my hunting knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, though I knew neither would do anything against that creature if it decided to come back. As soon as there was enough light to see by, I threw everything into my pack haphazardly, not caring about organization or even if I left something behind. I just needed to get out of there. Before I left, I forced myself to walk to the edge of the clearing where the creature had been uprooting trees. The evidence was all there, 6 or 7 young trees ripped completely out of the ground, their root systems exposed, the earth torn up around them. Nearby trees were damaged where the thrown saplings had hit them. This wasn't something I imagined or dreamed. It had really happened. I practically ran the 8 miles back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I passed a couple of hikers heading in, and they asked if I was okay. I must have looked terrible, wild-eyed, pale, covered in sweat. I just nodded and kept moving. I've never gone back to Mount Adams. I've barely gone hiking at all since then. I can't shake the knowledge that if that creature, that Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, had turned that same strength on me instead of those trees, there wouldn't be enough left of me for anyone to find. Sometimes I wonder why it didn't attack me. Was it just warning me off its territory? Was it curious about me? I'll never know. What I do know is that it was intelligent enough to understand intimidation, to show me what it was capable of, rather than actually doing it to me. I still wake up sometimes hearing that final yell echoing through the forest. I still see those dark eyes reflecting my firelight, that massive hand ripping trees from the earth like they were weeds in a garden. And I know with absolute certainty that we are not the only intelligent species in these forests. Story 14. I still can't sleep properly, and it's been over a decade since it happened. Every time I close my eyes at night and hear the wind in the trees outside my window, I'm right back there in those woods. I've been hesitant to share this experience because I know how it sounds. I've read other accounts, seen the TV shows, heard all the jokes, but what my hunting partner and I encountered on October 21st, 2012, in Michigan's Upper Peninsula wasn't a joke. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume, and I'll go to my grave knowing what I saw was real. We'd been planning our hunting trip for months. The spot we chose was remote, about 6 miles off Forest Highway 13 in a section of woods near the Hiawatha National Forest. You couldn't get there without a decent truck and local knowledge. It was accessible only by this narrow, overgrown 2-track that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The kind of place that makes GPS useless and where cell service is a distant memory. The evening before, we'd packed everything meticulously. Our rifles, ammo, day packs with provisions, extra layers, and all the usual gear. We set out from our cabin around 4 in the morning, driving in that comfortable silence that only exists between long-time hunting partners. The plan was simple. Get to our spot well before dawn, set up, and wait for the deer to start moving. We arrived at our destination around 5:15 in the morning, complete darkness still. The headlights of my truck cut through the fog, illuminating the wall of pine and maple trees on either side of the narrow trail. I kept the engine idling, partly for the heat, partly because something just felt off from the moment we arrived. The forest was too quiet. My buddy, who I won't name because he's still traumatized by this and doesn't want to be associated with what happened, was organizing his pack next to me. The dashboard clock read 5:30 when we heard it. A scream, but not just any scream. It started low, this deep guttural sound that rose in pitch until it became something between a howl and a wail. It came from the eastern side of the truck, maybe 100 yards away. It held for what felt like forever, probably just a few seconds in reality, before tapering off. We both froze. My buddy's hand was suspended mid-air, halfway to zipping his pack. "What the f..." he started to say, when a second scream cut him off. This one came from the opposite side of the truck, west side. Same pattern, low to high, sustained, then fading. But this one was different. Closer, angrier. "Coyotes?" I suggested, knowing damn well it wasn't. The volume alone ruled that out. This was loud enough to vibrate the truck windows. No coyote, owl, or bear makes a sound like that. It was deep and resonant in a way that settled into your bones. We sat there, neither wanting to be the first to suggest leaving. We were experienced hunters. We'd spent countless mornings in these woods, but this was different. By 5:45, things escalated. The sounds of movement started, heavy footfalls circling the truck. Not the light scurrying of small animals or even the deliberate steps of a bear. These were heavy impacts that broke branches and crushed through the leaf litter with purpose. Something's out there. Multiple somethings, my buddy whispered, his breath fogging the passenger window as he peered out into the darkness. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We were armed, but suddenly our rifles felt inadequate. A loud crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a substantial tree limb snapping, followed by a heavy thud that seemed to shake the ground. It wasn't a random branch falling. It sounded deliberate, like something had torn it down and thrown it. My buddy reached for his rifle. Maybe we should... Wait, I hissed, pointing through the windshield. The headlights, still on from our arrival, illuminated something moving between the trees about 50 yards ahead on the trail. At first, it was just a shadow shifting behind the trunks. Then, it stepped partially into view. I'll never forget what I saw. It was massive, well over 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful body. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, reaching almost to its knees. The entire body was covered in dark, shaggy hair. Not fur exactly, but longer, coarser looking. It moved with this fluid grace that nothing that size should possess. It positioned itself behind a tree, but kept watching us. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't make out its face clearly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered. My buddy's breathing had become shallow and quick. "There's another one." He was right. To the left of the first figure, a second form appeared. Slightly shorter, but still enormous, maybe 7.5 feet tall, with the same proportions. They weren't bears. Bears don't stand upright for that long. They don't have that silhouette. They don't move that way. The vocalizations intensified. Those initial screams evolved into a series of shorter, choppier sounds, halfway between screams and growls. The truly terrifying part was realizing they weren't coming from just the 2 figures we could see. There were at least 3 distinct sources of sound, maybe more, surrounding the truck. "We need to go," my buddy said, his voice cracking. "Now." Before I could respond, something struck the bed of my truck with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. It wasn't a branch falling, it was a deliberate hit, like something had slammed a fist or thrown something at us. The impact was followed immediately by a smell rolling into the cab through the vents. It was overwhelmingly foul, like wet, rotting fur mixed with skunk spray and something musky and animal. The kind of stench that makes your eyes water and triggers some primal part of your brain screaming, "Danger!" I reached for the ignition, but something stopped me. Some stupid, morbid curiosity. The sky had begun to lighten slightly. Not sunrise yet, but that pre-dawn grayness that lets you see shapes more clearly. In that dim light, we could make out at least 2 large figures pacing back and forth on the trail ahead of us. They moved with these long, smooth strides, covering ground faster than a human could walk. Their movements had purpose. They were boxing us in, keeping us trapped on the narrow trail. One detail has haunted me since. Their eyes caught what little light there was, reflecting back with a dull amber glow. Not the bright green reflection you get from deer or coyotes, something different, more subdued, but unmistakably there. By 6:30, the activity had escalated. More wood breaks, more impacts against the forest floor, more of those terrifying vocalizations exchanged like they were communicating. The figures had drawn closer, now about 30 yards from the truck, still moving between the trees, but becoming bolder. "We can't stay here," I said finally. My buddy nodded, white-knuckled grip on his rifle. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Immediately, a chorus of screams erupted from the forest around us. Not just 2 or 3 voices, but many, overlapping in this horrifying cacophony that no natural woodland should ever produce. I threw the truck into reverse, planning to back all the way out if necessary. As I turned to look behind us, my buddy grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered. In front of us, fully illuminated in the headlights, stood one of them, not partially hidden behind trees anymore, but right in the middle of the trail, staring directly at us. It was enormous, close to 9 feet tall with shoulders broader than any humans could be, a huge barrel chest and those disproportionately long arms hanging down to its knees. For a brief, terrifying moment, we saw it clearly. The face wasn't quite human, but it wasn't fully animal either. Heavy brow, deep-set eyes beneath, a flattened nose, and a mouth set in what looked like a snarl. The hair covered most of its body except around the face, where it was thinner. It wasn't a costume. No costume moves like that, has muscle definition like that, radiates presence like that. I slammed the truck into reverse and hit the gas harder than I meant to. The tires spun briefly before catching, and we lurched backward down the trail. As we moved, another impact struck the rear of the truck. Hard enough to dent the tailgate, I later discovered. We backed out as fast as we dared on that narrow trail, neither of us speaking. The only sounds are panicked breathing and the engine straining. I didn't stop or turn around until we hit the wider Forest Highway 13. We didn't speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive back. What was there to say when we finally discussed it? We agreed on a few things. What we encountered wasn't human. There were at least 4 of them. They had been coordinating and communicating, and they had deliberately intimidated us out of their territory. I haven't been back to that location since. Neither has my hunting partner. He moved out of state the following year, and we don't talk much anymore. When we do, we never mention what happened. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we experienced, reading about bears, studying local wildlife, looking into every possible explanation. None fit. I've read other accounts from the Upper Peninsula, stories that mirror ours in ways that make my skin crawl. I know what's out there. I just don't have a name for it that doesn't make me sound crazy. Sometimes I wonder if they were watching us long before we noticed them, if they followed our scent or the sound of the truck, if they were protecting something, if we had unknowingly crossed some boundary. All I know is what I saw. And on the bad nights, when I wake up sweating from dreams of those amber eyes and those screams, I remind myself that I was lucky. We drove away. We got to leave. I've never shared this publicly before. I probably won't again, but I need someone to know what's out there in those woods. If you're heading into the remote parts of the Upper Peninsula, especially near Hiawatha, remember, you might think you're the hunter, but you might actually be the hunted. Story 15. I still get chills thinking about what happened to us back in July of 2006. It's been years, but I can't shake the memory of that night in the woods. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or makes up stories for attention. Before this, I would have laughed if someone told me a story like the one I'm about to share. It was Friday, July 14th, 2006. My buddy Jack, another friend who doesn't want his name shared online for personal reasons, and I had planned a weekend camping trip in the John Muir Wilderness. We were all experienced hikers, not experts by any means, but we'd done plenty of overnight trips before. This was supposed to be just another adventure. We arrived at the Maxim trailhead near Courtright Reservoir around 5 in the afternoon. It was later than we'd planned, but the summer days were long, and we figured we had about 3 hours of good daylight left to reach Hobbler Lake, where we intended to camp. The weather was perfect, clear skies, around 75 degrees, with a light breeze. The kind of day that makes you glad to be outdoors. We shouldered our packs, did one last gear check, and hit the trail. The first mile or so was uneventful, just the 3 of us joking around, talking about work, and enjoying being away from the city. The trail was well maintained, but not heavily trafficked, especially on a Friday evening. We'd passed maybe 2 other hikers heading back to the trailhead, but otherwise had the wilderness to ourselves. About an hour into our hike, I noticed something moving through the trees to our right, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just a deer. But then I realized whatever it was seemed too big for a deer. The shape was reddish-brown, and my first thought was bear. I quietly pointed it out to Jack and our other friend. "You think that's a bear?" Jack whispered, squinting into the trees. "Probably," I replied, but something felt off. The movement wasn't quite right for a bear. It was too deliberate. We kept walking, keeping a casual eye on the figure as it moved parallel to our trail. Here's where things got weird. Whenever we stopped to take a water break or adjust our packs, this thing would stop too. When we started walking again, it would resume its path alongside us, always keeping that 50-yard distance, always staying just within the tree line where we couldn't get a clear view. After about 30 minutes of this, my neck was prickling with unease. "That's not normal bear behavior," our friend said quietly. "They don't typically follow people like this." "Maybe it's curious," I suggested, but I didn't believe that myself. Bears generally avoid people unless there's food involved. We hadn't even opened our packs for snacks yet. We decided to speed up our pace a bit. The creature matched us. We slowed down. It slowed too. This wasn't random. It was deliberately pacing us. By this point, we'd been followed for nearly an hour, and the sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the trail. "Let's make some noise," Jack suggested. So we started talking louder, occasionally clapping our hands and doing all the things you're supposed to do to scare bears away. The figure paused, but didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to move a bit deeper into the trees, becoming harder to spot, but still definitely there. As dusk settled in, we had to pull out our flashlights. We were still a good hour from Hobbler Lake, and the trail was getting harder to see. I was bringing up the rear of our little group, with Jack in front and our other friend in the middle. The forest had gone quiet, unnaturally quiet. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of our boots on the trail and our increasingly nervous conversation. That's when I heard it, a distinct snap of branches about 50 feet behind me. Not the small twigs that break under a squirrel's weight, but the heavy crack of substantial branches being stepped on by something big. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight back down the trail. The beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Standing behind a large pine tree, partially obscured but clearly visible, was a dark shape. It wasn't a bear. Bears, even standing on their hind legs, have a distinct silhouette. This was something else entirely. It stood about 7.5 feet tall, with shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too big, too broad. It had no visible neck. The head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. Its arms hung down past where its hips would be, unnaturally long. The most distinctive feature was its fur, thick, long, and shaggy. In my flashlight beam, it looked almost fluffy, covering the creature's entire body in a dark coat. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could tell it was watching us. Watching me. I whispered as calmly as I could manage. "Jack, shine your light back here." Slowly. "What is it?" he asked, turning. The moment I spoke, the creature reacted. It must have heard me because it immediately began to move. It didn't run like a startled animal, though. It turned deliberately and walked away with long strides, disappearing into the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. "Holy shit," our friend muttered. "Did you see that?" Jack's face had gone pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight steady. "But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, and they don't watch people like that." None of us said what we were thinking. We didn't need to. Growing up in California, we'd all heard the stories. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it. I'd always thought those stories were bullshit. The product of overactive imaginations or people mistaking bears for something else. Now I wasn't so sure. We stood there for maybe a minute, shining our lights into the woods, listening. There was no sound of retreat, no crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from a large animal moving away. Whatever this thing was, it moved quietly for its size. "We need to get to the lake," Jack finally said. "We're too exposed here." No one argued. We picked up our pace, practically power walking the rest of the way to Hobbler Lake. Every few minutes, one of us would shine a light behind us or to the sides, scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, still being followed, even though I couldn't see anything anymore. We reached Hobbler Lake around 10 that night. Under normal circumstances, we would have taken our time selecting the perfect campsite. But that night, we just wanted to get set up as quickly as possible. We found a relatively flat area near the shore, pitched our tents, and built a fire that was probably bigger than necessary. Sitting around that fire, none of us talked much about what we'd seen. It was like we were afraid that discussing it would somehow make it more real or maybe attract the attention of whatever was out there. Instead, we made small talk, ate some energy bars, and took turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. I don't think any of us got much rest that night. I kept jolting awake at every sound. The wind in the trees, the occasional splash of fish in the lake, the normal creaks and groans of the forest at night. Each time I'd lie there, heart pounding, straining to hear anything that might indicate our visitor had returned. Around 3 in the morning, I was woken by Jack shaking my shoulder. "Listen," he whispered. From the lake came the sound of something large moving through the water, not the small splashes of fish, but heavy, deliberate movements, like something wading along the shoreline. It was too dark to see anything. The moon had set, and the fire had burned down to embers. But the sounds were unmistakable. Water splashing, then the soft thud of something heavy stepping onto the shore, followed by silence. We sat there, barely breathing, as minutes stretched by with no further sounds. Eventually, Jack whispered, "I'm going to build up the fire." He carefully added more wood, and as the flames grew, we scanned the shoreline. There was nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. When morning finally came, we emerged from our tents exhausted and on edge. Over a hurried breakfast, my friends told me they'd both heard the splashing in the lake during the night. Whatever it was, had been about 100 yards from our camp, moving through the water. "We need to decide what we're doing," our friend said. "Do we stay or head back?" After some discussion, we decided to stay. Daylight made everything seem less threatening, and none of us wanted to admit that we'd been scared off by something we couldn't even properly identify. Besides, we'd hiked all that way. It seemed a shame to turn around without at least spending a day at the lake. We spent the morning fishing and exploring the immediate area around our campsite, always staying within sight of each other. Around noon, we decided to hike up to a nearby ridge that was supposed to offer great views of the surrounding wilderness. We didn't take all our gear, just day packs with water, snacks, and basic emergency supplies. Before leaving, we made sure our campsite was secure. Food properly stored in bear canisters, tents zipped shut, everything in order. The hike up to the ridge took about 2 hours. The view was indeed spectacular, and for a little while we almost forgot about our unsettling experience from the night before. Almost. We were having lunch on the ridge when we heard it. Faint but distinct sounds coming from the direction of our campsite. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't small animals. It sounded like someone or something moving around down there. We cut our lunch short and headed back down, making more noise than necessary, calling out to each other even when we didn't need to. I think we all hoped that if it was our visitor from yesterday, the noise would drive it off before we got back. When we reached our campsite, everything looked normal at first glance. The tents were still standing, our bear canisters were undisturbed. But as we looked closer, we noticed small things that were off. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now lying on its side. Jack's tent flap, which he'd zipped closed, was partially open. A few items, a camp towel, a book I'd brought along, my spare boots, had been moved from where we'd left them. It wasn't the kind of destruction you'd expect from a bear or other animal looking for food. There was something almost careful about it, like someone had gone through our things methodically, examining them, and then tried to put them back. "This is messed up," Jack said, checking inside his tent. "Nothing's missing, but someone definitely went through my stuff." "Not someone," our friend replied quietly. "Something." We spent the rest of the afternoon in uneasy silence, staying close to camp, keeping the fire going even though it was warm out. None of us said it, but I know we were all thinking the same thing. We should leave, we should pack up and hike out, even if it meant reaching the trailhead after dark. But a stubborn part of me didn't want to be chased away. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was other hikers playing a prank. Maybe we were all on edge from lack of sleep and imagining things. As the sun began to set, that rationalization became harder to maintain. The forest grew quiet again. That same unnatural silence from the previous evening. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just stillness. "We're leaving at first light tomorrow," Jack finally said. No one disagreed. That night was worse than the first. We took turns keeping watch, two sleeping while one stayed up with the flashlight and a hiking pole as a makeshift weapon. Around midnight, during my watch, I heard it again, heavy footsteps circling our camp, just beyond the reach of our firelight, never coming closer, never fully retreating, just circling. I woke the others, and we sat huddled by the fire, watching the darkness. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of movement among the trees, a shadow passing between trunks, the slight swaying of branches with no wind to move them. Once, just once, I saw what looked like eyes reflecting our firelight from about 50 yards away. They were set too high off the ground to be a bear or a deer, and they didn't have the close-set position of a mountain lion. They were wide apart, like a person's, but at a height that would make that person well over 7 feet tall. They watched us for maybe 30 seconds before disappearing. None of us slept after that. We kept the fire blazing and talked in low voices until dawn, trying to distract ourselves from the knowledge that something was out there, watching and waiting. As soon as there was enough light to see the trail, we packed up with record speed. We didn't bother with breakfast or even coffee. We just wanted out of there. The hike back was a blur. We moved fast, barely stopping for water breaks, constantly scanning the trees around us. Nothing followed us, at least nothing we could see. But that feeling of being watched didn't fade until we were within sight of the trailhead. Reaching our car was like breaking through the surface after being underwater too long. The relief was physical. We threw our packs in the trunk and got the hell out of there. In the years since, I've tried to convince myself that we overreacted, that it was just a bear, and our tired, stressed minds turned it into something more sinister. But then I remember those eyes watching us from the darkness. I remember the deliberate way it paced us on the trail. I remember those careful, almost curious disturbances to our campsite. Whatever was in those woods with us wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered before or since. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still there, following hikers who venture too deep into its territory, watching them from just beyond the firelight. Story 16. I've been debating whether to share this for years. What happened to me in July of 1995 has stayed with me, even though I've tried to rationalize it countless times. I'm not the type who believes in cryptids or monsters, but what I saw that day near Jasper, Alberta, doesn't fit into any neat explanation I can come up with. It was supposed to be a normal hiking trip. My friend and I had been planning to tackle the Sulphur Ridge Trail for weeks. We were both experienced hikers, had all the right gear, and knew the area pretty well. The weather was perfect that day. Clear skies, around 70 degrees, with just a light breeze. We got an early start around 7 in the morning, wanting to reach the summit and make it back down before dark. The first few hours were completely uneventful. We stopped a couple times to rest, drink water, and take in the scenery. The mountains in Jasper are breathtaking, the kind of views that make you feel tiny and insignificant. We were making good time until we hit a section where the trail had eroded away. Nothing dangerous, but we had to pick our way carefully across some loose rocks. We decided to take a proper break at this point. It was around 6 in the evening, and we'd been hiking for almost 11 hours with just short breaks. My legs were starting to feel it, especially my calves. I remember sitting on this flat rock that was warm from the sun, digging through my backpack for my water bottle and some trail mix. The hot springs were visible below us, and I thought it would make a great photo, so I pulled out my camera. I should mention it wasn't a digital camera. This was 1995, so I was using a basic Canon film camera. Nothing fancy, but it took decent pictures. I snapped a couple shots of the hot springs and the valley below. That's when I looked up toward the summit. At first, I didn't think much of it. There was what looked like a person standing up there, silhouetted against the sky. The sun was starting to get lower, but there was still plenty of daylight. My first thought was that it was another hiker. Makes sense, right? It's a popular trail, even if we hadn't seen many people that day. So I did what any friendly hiker would do. I started waving. I even remember calling out hello, though there's no way they could have heard me from that distance. I even pointed my camera in that direction, though I didn't take a picture because they were too far away to come out clearly. The figure didn't wave back, didn't move at all. That's when I really focused on it, squinting to see better. What I saw still gives me chills when I think about it. It wasn't a person, it was humanoid, yes, standing upright with arms and legs like a human, but it was covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur all over, and the proportions were off. The arms seemed too long, the shoulders too wide. I nudged my friend and pointed. "You see that?" I asked. My friend nodded, not saying anything, just staring. We both watched for what must have been 2 or 3 minutes. Though it felt much longer, the figure just stood there motionless, as if surveying the landscape or watching us. Then it started moving, not walking away or turning around. It began running down the face of the mountain, straight down. Now I need to emphasize something here. This wasn't a gentle slope. This was a steep mountainside with loose rocks and gravel. The kind of terrain where even experienced hikers would carefully pick their way down, using switchbacks and taking their time. This, whatever it was running straight down at an incredible speed. My first thought, as ridiculous as it sounds now, was that it must be some crazy mountain biker. That was the only explanation my brain could come up with for the speed. But there was no bike, no equipment, just this dark figure moving with an agility that defied physics. "What the hell is that?" my friend whispered. I couldn't answer. I was trying to process what I was seeing. The creature, because I knew by then it wasn't human, reached the tree line in seconds. That's when I got another shock. It stood much taller than some of the trees. For reference, the trees at the tree line in that area are at least 7 feet tall, probably taller. This thing towered over them, then it disappeared into the forest. My friend and I just stood there, stunned. The weird thing is, we didn't immediately talk about what we'd seen. It's like our brains couldn't process it. We packed up our stuff and continued hiking toward the summit as if nothing had happened. I remember feeling strangely detached, like I was on autopilot. It wasn't until we reached the top of the tree line that reality started to sink in. We were traversing the same path that the creature had run down, and it was brutal. Loose rocks shifted under our feet with every step. Even moving carefully, I slipped twice and scraped my hands, catching myself. The idea of running down this, impossible, completely impossible for a human. I remember looking down at the forest where the creature had disappeared. The trees were thick, really thick, with no visible trails. The terrain was so steep and treacherous that you couldn't safely climb down there without proper equipment. Whatever we saw had just plunged straight into it, like it was nothing. We reached the summit about 30 minutes later. The view was incredible, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. A bear? No way. Bears don't run like that, and they certainly don't stand like humans at the top of mountains. A moose? Too fast, too agile. Some other animal I wasn't familiar with? Nothing that size moves that way. We started our descent earlier than planned. Neither of us said it out loud, but I think we both wanted to get off that mountain before dark. The hike down was tense. We kept scanning the trees, looking for movement. About halfway down, I felt it. That sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. That then we heard it. Something moving through the forest, parallel to the trail. Not right next to us, but close enough that we could hear branches snapping and underbrush rustling. Whatever it was keeping pace with us. "Do you hear that?" my friend whispered, voice tight with fear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We picked up our pace. The sounds followed us. For at least half a mile, something tracked us through those woods. Sometimes the sounds would fade, and I'd think it was gone, only for a loud snap to come from a different direction, as if it was circling around. By this point, the sun was getting lower. We still had maybe an hour of good daylight left, but the forest was already darkening. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more menacing. That's when we both abandoned any pretense of calm and started running. Not a full sprint. The trail was too rough for that, but a fast jog that had us both gasping for breath. The sounds kept pace with us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I've been in the woods all my life, and I've never heard anything move like that. Something big enough to make that much noise, but agile enough to keep up with two humans jogging downhill. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. By then, my legs were burning, and I had a stitch in my side so painful I could barely stand upright. My friend looked just as bad, bent over with hands on knees, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty except for our car. As we fumbled with the keys, I looked back toward the trail one last time. The forest seemed normal, peaceful even. No movement, no sounds other than birds and the distant rush of water. We drove back to our place in silence. It wasn't until we were sitting in our living room, still in our dusty hiking clothes, that we finally talked about it. Our other roommates joined the conversation, and one of them, who was really into cryptozoology and that sort of thing, immediately suggested it was a Sasquatch. I laughed it off at the time. It sounded ridiculous. But the next day, we went back. I don't know why exactly. To prove to ourselves that we'd imagined it. To look for evidence. Whatever the reason, we returned to the same trail. In daylight, with 4 of us instead of 2, my fear from the previous day seemed silly, exaggerated. Until we reached the spot where we'd seen it. Looking up at that steep, treacherous slope, I was even more convinced that no human could have run down it the way that creature did. We spent some time examining the area where it had disappeared into the forest. The trees were thick, the underbrush nearly impenetrable. There were no trails, no signs that anything had passed through recently. But as we hiked back down that afternoon, we heard it again. The sounds of something large moving through the forest, keeping pace with us. This time, all 4 of us heard it. We didn't run. Safety in numbers, I guess, but we moved quickly, constantly scanning the trees for any glimpse of what was following us. We never saw anything, not directly, but twice I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape shifting between trees, gone before I could focus on it. When I got home and developed the pictures from our trip, I scrutinized every single one, looking for any sign of the creature. There was nothing. Not even a blur or shadow that could have been it. Just mountains, trees, and 4 scared hikers trying to look brave for the camera. It's been over 25 years since that day on Sulphur Ridge. I've hiked hundreds of trails since then, seen all kinds of wildlife. But I've never seen anything like what I saw that July evening in 1995. I've tried to convince myself it was a bear or a moose or some other known animal, but nothing fits. Sometimes I still wake up from dreams where I'm back on that mountain, watching that dark figure running down an impossible slope. In the dreams, it doesn't disappear into the forest. Instead, it keeps coming straight for me. I always wake up before it reaches me. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that it was real. It was watching us, and for whatever reason, it let us leave its territory unharmed. And sometimes, when I'm hiking in dense forest and hear an unexpected sound behind me, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching from the trees. Story 17. I've been debating whether to share this experience for a long time. Even now, 44 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about what my buddy Mike and I discovered that day in Montana. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or makes up stories for attention. I worked construction most of my life, kept my head down, and minded my own business. But what happened in June of 1979 near Whitefish changed something in me forever. It was the second weekend of June, unusually hot for that time of year in Montana. Mike and I had planned to do some fishing at this quiet creek we knew about just outside of town. The spot was perfect. Not many people knew about it. It cut through both open fields and some wooded areas, and usually had decent trout if you knew where to look. We parked Mike's old pickup about a quarter-mile from the creek and hiked in with our gear around 9 in the morning. The air was still cool then, with that crisp Montana mountain smell that's hard to describe if you've never experienced it. Birds were singing, and everything felt normal, peaceful even. We'd been walking along the creek for maybe 20 minutes, occasionally stopping to check promising pools, when Mike suddenly froze mid-step. "Hey, what the hell is that?" he said, pointing toward a small sandbar in the middle of the shallow stream. At first I didn't see anything special, just wet sand, but as I got closer, I saw exactly what had stopped him in his tracks. There, pressed deep into the wet sand, was what looked like a footprint, but not just any footprint. This thing was massive. That can't be real, I said, kneeling down to look closer. The print was perfectly defined in the wet sand. Toes, arch, heel. It looked human-like, but was impossibly large. I put my hand next to it, and my entire hand barely covered the width of the ball of the foot. My stomach did this weird flip, like when you miss a step going downstairs. "There's more," Mike said, already moving ahead. Sure enough, there were 3 perfect prints across the sandbar, each one clear as day. I'd hunted all my life and knew animal tracks. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't have a distinct heel and 5 toes like that. It wasn't a moose or elk. Totally wrong shape. These looked human, just enormous. We followed the tracks to where they left the sandbar and continued onto a gravel bank nearby. The impressions were slightly less defined in the harder ground, but still unmistakable. What really got me was the distance between them, the stride. I'm 6 foot tall with a decent stride myself, and I had to stretch almost to the point of jumping to match the distance between these prints. "We need to measure these," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Mike grabbed a piece of string from his tackle box, and we measured one of the clearer prints, 17 inches long, 9 inches across at the widest point. For comparison, I wear a size 11 boot, which is about 12 inches long. The stride, the distance between prints, was nearly 5 feet. Think about that. The average human stride is maybe 2.5 feet. This was double that. We tracked the prints from the creek bank into the adjacent pasture. The grass was bent and flattened in a clear path that matched the stride pattern we'd seen in the sand. Whatever left those prints had walked with purpose across the landscape, not wandering or stopping much, just moving deliberately from point A to point B. I remember standing there in that field, looking at those tracks, and feeling something I hadn't felt since I was a little kid. A deep, primal fear of the unknown. The world suddenly seemed much bigger and stranger than I'd believed just an hour earlier. We need to tell someone about this, Mike said finally. I nodded, but part of me didn't want to. Part of me wanted to just go home, have a beer, and pretend we'd never seen anything. But the rational part of my brain knew this was something significant. We abandoned our fishing plans and drove straight to the Whitefish police station. I half expected them to laugh us out of the building, but the officer at the desk took one look at our faces and listened seriously. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Not a ghost," I replied, "but something." We explained what we'd found, trying to sound as level-headed as possible. The officer made some calls, and within an hour, we were leading a small group back to the creek. The same officer, a local forest ranger named Johnson, and a game warden whose name I can't recall now. The whole drive back, I was worried the prints would be gone, washed away by the creek or just disappeared somehow. But they were still there, just as clear as when we'd left. The officials' reactions were validating. They were as stunned as we had been. The game warden spent a long time examining the tracks, measuring them himself, taking notes. He was the most experienced outdoorsman among them, and I'll never forget what he said after about 20 minutes of silent examination. "Whatever made these weighs at least 700 pounds, probably more," he stated matter-of-factly. "Bigger than any bear I've documented in this region, and it's not walking like a bear either." The forest ranger nodded in agreement. "These are purposeful tracks. Look at how direct the path is, not meandering like an animal foraging, and there's no sign it was dragging anything or that anything was dragged behind it. No tail marks, no irregular impressions. They took plaster casts of several of the clearest prints. I'd never seen that done before except on TV, and it was fascinating watching the white plaster slowly harden in those enormous depressions." The ranger said they'd send the casts to the University of Montana for analysis. While they worked, I walked further along the track line, following those massive footprints across the field. They continued in a straight line toward a dense stand of trees about 200 yards away. I stopped at the edge of the woods, suddenly aware I was alone and potentially following something I didn't understand. The forest looked darker than it should have in the midday sun, and I felt an overwhelming urge not to enter it alone. I rejoined the others, and nobody suggested following the tracks into the woods. Maybe they felt the same thing I did. We all stood there at the edge of that field, staring at the tree line, not saying much. Later, back at the police station, we gave formal statements. The officer was professional, but I could tell he was disturbed. He asked if we'd seen anything else unusual. Strange lights, heard any sounds, noticed any missing livestock in the area. We hadn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those tracks and what could have made them. I've seen grizzlies up close, and even the biggest ones don't leave prints like that or walk with that stride pattern. My mind kept going to the obvious explanation, but I didn't want to even think the word. The next morning, a brief article appeared in the local paper about unusual tracks being found, but it was vague and buried on page 5. When I called the police station a few days later to ask about the results from the university, the person I spoke with said they'd get back to me. They never did. A week later, I ran into the forest ranger at the hardware store. I asked him directly about the tracks, and he seemed uncomfortable, saying only that the investigation was ongoing and that the university experts weren't making any definitive statements. His eyes wouldn't meet mine, and he changed the subject quickly. That summer, there were whispers around town about other sightings. A rancher who saw something massive moving through his north pasture at dusk. Hikers who heard strange vocalizations near the national forest boundary. Even a truck driver who claimed something huge crossed the highway in front of him in the early morning hours. But nothing official ever came of our discovery, at least nothing that was shared with us. Mike and I went back to that creek spot about a month later. The sandbar had been washed away by higher water, and any trace of those tracks in the field was long gone. It was as if that day had never happened, except for the memory burned into my mind. I've spent countless hours over the years trying to find a rational explanation for what we found. The most logical part of me still wants to believe it was an elaborate hoax, someone with too much time on their hands, creating fake footprints. But then I remember the depth of those impressions, the clear weight distribution across the foot, the perfect stride pattern extending across multiple types of terrain. Who would go to that much trouble in such a remote location? I've never been a believer in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm still not really. But I know what I saw that day, and it wasn't anything officially recognized by science. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I still think about those tracks and wonder what might be out there in the forests and mountains of Montana, moving quietly between the trees, leaving only the occasional footprint as evidence of its passing. Whatever it was, it moved with intelligence and purpose, and it was big, really big. That's the part that still makes my skin crawl all these years later. Not just that something unknown might exist, but that something that size could remain largely hidden in our modern world. I've never gone back to that specific creek again. Call it superstition or just common sense, but some mysteries are better left alone. I still fish other spots, still hike in the woods, but I'm more aware now, more observant. And yeah, sometimes when I'm deep in the trees and the light starts to fade, I walk a little faster to get back to my truck before dark falls completely. Story 18. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night in August 1967. It's been decades, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I can smell that awful stench again. I was stationed at Fort Lewis in Thurston County, Washington. For those unfamiliar with military training, we had these exercises called escape and evasion, where basically they'd dump us in the wilderness and we had to evade capture while making our way to a designated checkpoint. It was supposed to simulate being behind enemy lines. This particular night, me and my buddy, let's call him Davis, we had this brilliant idea to get ahead of everyone else. The exercise was scheduled to begin at 2200 hours, but we slipped out of the boundary around 2130. We figured we'd watch everyone scramble around from a distance, get a feel for the patrol patterns, then make our move when we had the advantage. It was a beautiful August night, unusually clear for Washington. The moon was so bright you could almost read by it. The air had that crisp pine smell, and it was cool enough that our breath made little clouds in front of our faces. Perfect conditions for night navigation. We made our way to this elevated position that overlooked a large meadow, maybe 300 yards across. There was this small cluster of rocks where we could hunker down and watch the whole exercise unfold below us. We were feeling pretty smug about our plan. Davis was digging through his pack looking for his canteen when I noticed something at the far end of the meadow. 3 large figures standing at the tree line. I nudged Davis and pointed. "Look over there. Must be Sergeant Mills and his team already setting up." Davis squinted. "They're out early too, huh? Probably the aggressors for tonight's exercise." The moonlight was hitting the meadow just right, illuminating these 3 figures in silhouette. 2 of them were massive. I mean really huge, probably 6.5 or 7 feet tall. The third was smaller, maybe 5 feet or so, but still had the same general shape. At first, I just assumed they were other soldiers wearing rucksacks or equipment that made them look bulky. Davis, always the friendly type, stood up and waved his arms. "Hey, you guys starting early too?" His voice carried across the meadow, clearly in the night air. I remember thinking he was an idiot for giving away our position, but what happened next made me forget all about the exercise. The figures turned toward us almost in unison. There was something unnatural about the movement, too fluid, too coordinated. Then they started moving in our direction. They didn't run exactly, it was more like a fast walk, but they covered ground quicker than seemed possible, and they were completely silent. No calling back to us, no sounds of boots on the ground, no equipment rattling, nothing. That's when I felt it, this primal fear that started in the pit of my stomach and spread through my entire body. I've been hunting since I was a kid. I've tracked deer, elk, even had a close encounter with a black bear once in Montana. Nothing, and I mean nothing, ever made me feel the way I did in that moment. Those aren't people, I whispered to Davis. I could see his face in the moonlight. His eyes were wide, mouth slightly open. He felt it too. Whatever was coming across that meadow wasn't human. "Run," was all he said, and we both took off. We sprinted across the meadow in the opposite direction. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My combat boots felt like they were filled with lead. Every few seconds, I'd glance back over my shoulder, and those figures were still coming. They weren't running either, just maintaining that same unnaturally fast walk. The tree line seemed to take forever to reach. When we finally hit it, Davis spotted a large pine with branches that hung low to the ground, creating a sort of natural tent. Without a word, we both dove under it. The pine needles were thick underneath us, which I hoped would mask our scent. We lay there trying to control our breathing, which felt impossible with my heart practically bursting through my rib cage. "What the hell was that?" Davis whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied honestly. We stayed silent after that, straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. The normal forest noises had stopped. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, nothing, just dead silence. Then we smelled it. It hit me like a physical force. This overwhelming putrid odor. It was like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I couldn't identify, all mixed together. I'd been hunting all over the country, field-dressed deer, encountered skunks, even helped clean out a neglected chicken coop once. Nothing compared to this smell. It was so strong I had to press my sleeve against my nose to keep from gagging. Davis looked at me with panic in his eyes. I put my finger to my lips, silently begging him to stay quiet. That's when we heard them. Not footsteps exactly, more like the soft displacement of pine needles and the occasional snap of a twig. They were moving around our hiding spot, circling. I could sense their presence more than hear them. It was like that feeling you get when someone's watching you, but 100 times more intense. I remember thinking about my rifle back at the barracks and how badly I wished I had it with me. All we had were our combat knives, which suddenly seemed completely inadequate. The smell got stronger, and I knew one of them was right next to our hiding spot. I could see Davis trembling, his eyes squeezed shut. I was frozen, barely breathing, convinced that any second a huge hand was going to reach under the branches and drag us out. Then I heard something that still haunts me, a sort of low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, more like a very deep, quiet huffing. It wasn't a sound any human could make. It resonated in my chest like standing too close to a bass speaker. There was some kind of communication happening between them, soft whoops and those deep, huffing sounds. No words, nothing that resembled human speech, but they were clearly communicating. I don't know how long we stayed under that tree. It felt like hours, but was probably about 15 minutes. Eventually, the smell started to fade, and the forest sounds slowly returned. We waited another 10 minutes just to be safe before Davis whispered, "I think they're gone." I nodded, but neither of us moved for another 5 minutes. When we finally crawled out from under the tree, my legs were so stiff I could barely stand. We looked around carefully, straining to see in the moonlight filtering through the trees. Nothing. The forest looked normal again. "Back to the road," Davis suggested, his voice still shaky. I nodded, and we started walking, quickly but quietly, back in the direction of the compound. Neither of us spoke. I think we were both afraid that talking about what happened would somehow make it more real, or worse, summon them back. When we reached the road, I've never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. We practically jogged back to the compound, constantly looking over our shoulders. Here's the thing, Back in 1967, at least where I was from, Bigfoot or Sasquatch wasn't really a thing people talked about. The Patterson-Gimlin film hadn't even come out yet, so when we got back to the barracks, we didn't know what to call what we'd seen. I remember Davis trying to make sense of it that night, whispering across the dark room. Maybe they were bears standing up. But we both knew better. Bears don't walk upright for that long. They don't move with that fluid, silent gait. And while bears can smell pretty bad, that odor was something different entirely. The next morning, neither of us mentioned what happened. Not to each other, not to anyone else. What would we say? That we saw monsters in the woods. We'd have been laughed out of the barracks. Besides, we weren't supposed to have left the boundary early, so we'd have been in trouble for that too. A few weeks later, I was flipping through a newspaper when I saw a small article about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There was a crude sketch that made my blood run cold. The proportions, the upright stance, it matched what we'd seen. I showed it to Davis. He looked at it for a long time, then handed it back without a word. We never really talked about it again. Over the years, I've read everything I can find about Bigfoot encounters. The details that always stand out to me are the same ones from our experience. The overwhelming stench, the eerie silence, the unnatural movement, and that feeling of absolute primal terror. I've spent a lot of time in the woods since then. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, even a moose once that could have easily killed me. None of them triggered that same instinctual fear response. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't a known animal. I don't know what they were. I can't explain how three massive creatures could move through a forest without making normal sounds. I can't explain why they followed us or why they didn't attack when they clearly knew where we were hiding. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe we were in their territory. What I do know is that I've never felt more like prey than I did that night under the pine tree. And I'm absolutely certain that what we encountered wasn't human. It wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I still find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those silhouettes again, standing silently, watching,